Item, SCP-034, the Obsidian Knife. Object Class, Safe. Special Containment Procedures. SCP-034 is to be kept in a secure room with access granted only to Level 4 personnel. SCP-034 itself will be kept in a locked case that is under 24-hour surveillance. When not in lab conditions, SCP-034's protective sheath cannot be removed under any circumstances. Any personnel in contact with SCP-034 must be placed under a 24-hour observation period until their identities can be confirmed. Description: SCP-034 is a primitive knife constructed out of pure obsidian. Tests reveal that SCP-034 is approximately 1,000 years old. Despite its crude method of construction and age, SCP-034 is still incredibly sharp and requires no maintenance to retain its edge. Expert analysis hypothesizes that SCP-034 may be of South American origin and that it may have been used in Native American rituals. Several accounts from Spanish conquistadors exploring the region support this hypothesis, with detailed writings on how priests would flay their victims alive with similar knives and wear their skin as a tribute to their gods. SCP-034 has the ability to allow its bearer to take on the appearance of another individual. If SCP-034 is used to cut a piece of flesh from a living individual, and that piece of flesh is placed against the skin of another individual, the second individual would take on not only the appearance but all physical characteristics of the first individual. Testing has shown that the minimum amount of skin required can be as little as 1 square centimeter. However, testing has also revealed that the amount of time the transformation lasts is directly proportional to the amount of flesh used. The ratio of time the transformation lasts to flesh used has been measured at approximately 1 hour for every square centimeter used. Once the time limit has passed, the affected individual will revert to their original form. Analysis of SCP-034's ability shows that its method of mimicking another individual is nearly flawless. Not only does SCP-034 change its bearer's physical appearance, but their actual physical attributes as well, including height, weight, muscle mass, bone density, hair growth, eyesight, strength, physical medical conditions, and even DNA. The only physical traits that are not carried over in the transformation process are wounds caused by SCP-034 itself. Subjects still retain their original personality and memories while transformed. Even though the process is nearly instantaneous, taking only a few seconds, human test subjects have described the transformation process as extremely painful. Subjects also may suffer psychological trauma depending on the extent of their physical transformation. Side effects are especially serious if the subject takes on the appearance of a person with differing gender or with wildly different physical attributes. However, in order to function properly, the individuals who have their flesh cut off by SCP-034 must still be biologically alive to maintain the transformation. Should the individual whose identity has been stolen expire, the effect immediately wears off. Further details may be found in Lab Report 034-A. Also, SCP-034 only appears to work on human subjects. Cross-species experiments with SCP-034 have resulted in data expunged. SCP-034 came into Foundation possession when an imposter disguised as Doctor attempted to infiltrate the site. The imposter was apprehended when authorities discovered the real Doctor tied up in his home with a large portion of his right arm skinned. Further details may be found in Post-Interrogation Report 2211. Lab Report 034-A. We've decided to test several scenarios dealing with the limits of SCP-034's capabilities. Test 1. Sample was taken from a deceased human cadaver and applied to subject D-452. There is no observable effect. Test 2. Sample was taken from D-532 and applied to D-452. D452 successfully mimics D532's appearance. Upon termination of D532, D452 immediately reverts back to the original form. Test 3. Sample was taken from D433 while under a medically induced coma and applied to subject D452. D452 successfully mimics D433's appearance and manages to maintain the transformation and consciousness. Test 4. Sample was taken from a brain-dead medical patient who suffered a massive brain hemorrhage and applied to D452. D452 successfully mimics the patient's appearance but immediately loses consciousness upon transformation. D452 does not regain consciousness until the transformation period expires. D452 retains no memory of the event. Test 5. Sample was taken from D625, who suffered a broken arm due to a confrontation with security staff. D452 successfully mimics D625's appearance, including the broken arm. D452's broken arm is remended when the transformation period expires. Test 6. Sample was taken from a terminally ill medical patient and applied to D452. The patient's terminal illness was caused by an inherent genetic defect. D452 successfully mimics the patient's appearance as well as the patient's illness. Both the terminally ill patient and D452 expire at the same time, after which D452 reverts back to the original form. Test 7. Sample was taken from a chimpanzee and applied to D466. D466 experiences rapid growth of hair across their entire body. There are otherwise no other significant physical or physiological changes. Body hair disappears when the transformation period expires. Test 8. Sample was taken from an Atlantic salmon and applied to D466. There is no observable effect. Test 9. Under O5 authorization, a sample taken from SCP is applied to D466. D466 exhibits extremely adverse reactions upon transformation and, data expunged, resulting in significant damage to the testing environment, multiple injuries among test and security staff, and the death of D466. The testing of anomalous humanoids with SCP-034 is suspended indefinitely. Post-Interrogation Report 2211. As per standard operating procedure, we first attempted to interrogate the prisoner via non-violent and non-invasive means. However, when such methods proved ineffective, we began to implement conventional interrogation techniques. While partially successful, we deemed it necessary to use SCP, 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 and SCP. We managed to learn the following facts. The prisoner had extensive knowledge of the existence of the Foundation and its inner workings. The prisoner had extensive knowledge on other SCP-related agencies and groups. The prisoner was not acting under any official capacity from any government agency. The prisoner obtained SCP-034 and instructions on its operation from an unknown benefactor. The prisoner was given very specific instructions to infiltrate site and maintain his position until further notice. The prisoner had enough samples of Dr. to stay within site for days. Regrettably, the prisoner did not survive interrogation. Agent
Item, SCP-023. Object Class, Euclid. Special Containment Procedures. SCP-023 is to be contained in a walled-off inner section of 2 corridors at site data expunged, with at least 3 meters of space in each direction, and full stores at 3 of the 4 ends, in addition to the real door. Security cameras will be placed and maintained above all 4 doors. At all times, SCP-023's eye sockets are to be filled with spherical inserts made of hard rubber. Eye inserts must be replaced as they degrade. Degradation can be monitored by measuring the brightness of the burning effect as observed by security footage. Brightness greater than 12 candela requires that the inserts be replaced within 12 hours. Eye inserts are only to be replaced individually, and only after the sun has completely set. Personnel are not to look directly into eye sockets of SCP-023 at any time. Following Incident 02327, all reflective surfaces, including displays, monitors, and eyewear of any sort are not permitted within 30 meters of SCP-023's cell. This includes monitors linked to security cameras within its enclosure. Security personnel posted at checkpoints outside both corridors will enforce and adhere to this measure. Experimentation involving SCP-023 has been suspended indefinitely. Description: SCP-023 is a large, sexless shaggy canine, 1.5 meters at the shoulder, with black fur. Data expunged. See Incident Report 02326. Anytime an individual makes eye contact with SCP-023, either that person or a member of their immediate family will die exactly 1 year after eye contact is broken. Research into the method of selection is incomplete due to a moratorium on experiments, but the available data suggests that having a larger immediate family lessens the chance of the individual making eye contact themselves dying, and neither a pattern nor a preference in victim types have been found. This may indicate that SCP-023's victim is designated entirely at random, but it is unknown whether this selection occurs at the beginning or at the end of the 1-year time period. Attempts to terminate an individual who has made eye contact with SCP-023 and their entire immediate family before the 1-year time period has ended. Data expunged. Autopsies of individuals killed by SCP-023's effect show that, while outwardly appearing unharmed, their remains have been filled in with highly compacted ash, including but not limited to all organ systems and the circulatory system. Muscle tissue, bones, and brain tissue universally show signs of exposure to temperatures above. Data expunged. If not contained in a setting that at least superficially resembles a crossroads, SCP-023 will phase through walls to get to the nearest suitable location, incinerating all materials it passes through. SCP-023 was first brought to the Foundation's attention when it attacked a church in Data expunged while it was in session, killing Data expunged civilians directly and, redacted, as a result of eye contact. Following retrieval of SCP-023, Class B amnesiacs were administered to all witnesses and surviving victims. The incident was covered up as a case of arson. Addendum 023001. SCP-023 broke containment on Data expunged by passing through its cell wall. Incident 02301. SCP-023 was later discovered at the intersection of two corridors elsewhere on site. Data expunged. Agent Data expunged noted SCP-023's similarity to a redacted. Special Containment Procedures for SCP-023 updated. Assistant Researcher Data expunged issued a reprimand for negligence. Addendum 023002. SCP-023 has been responsible for the deaths of data-expunged personnel and data-expunged civilians since it was first brought into containment on 10/12/data-expunged. Addendum 023003. Request for reclassification to Keter pending. Addendum 023004. Due to both anomalies focusing on specific geographic spaces, their destructive capabilities, and canine appearance, it is possible that SCP-1111-1 may be a variant of the same phenomenon observed in SCP-023, or vice versa. Investigation into the origin of both anomalies is ongoing. Due to the inability to capture SCP-1111-1 for study, investigations are currently focused on SCP-023.
There are creatures of myth out there that you would want to stay away from. These creatures comes from the thing of nightmares and will truly haunt your dreams, having you wake up in a cold sweat. So with that in mind, here is the top 5 urban mythical creatures that will haunt your dreams. 5. The Chupacabra. Chupacabra, translated as goatsucker, is a reptile-like creature, said to have leathery or scaly greenish skin and sharp spines or quills running down its back. It is said to be approximately 3 to 4 feet high and stands and hops in a fashion similar to that of a kangaroo. The first reported attack occurred in March 1995 in Puerto Rico. 8 sheep were discovered dead, each with 3 puncture wounds in 3 chest area and completely drained of blood. So a vampire-type creature, that can sneak up behind you, without you knowing, and suck all your blood out, definitely not something I would like to see in my dreams. 4. The Banshee. There are many varying descriptions of the Banshee. Sometimes she has long streaming hair and wears a gray cloak over a green dress, and her eyes are red from continual weeping. She may even be dressed in white with red hair and a ghastly complexion. Sometimes the Banshee assumes the form of some sweet-singing virgin of the family who died young, and has been given the mission by invisible powers to become the harbinger of coming doom to her mortal kindred. The Uabrian Banshee is thought to be named Abel and the ruler of 25 other Banshees who would always be at her attendance. It is possible that this possible story is the source of the idea that the wailing or numerous Banshees signifies the death of a great person. When several Banshees appear at once, it indicates the death of a great or holy person. The tale sometimes recounted that the woman, though called a fairy, was a ghost, often of a specified murdered woman, or a mother who died in childbirth. So hearing the wailing of the nearby Banshee that no one else can hear is not my idea of a great night or day. 3. The Headless Horseman. The Headless Horseman is traditionally depicted as a man upon his horse missing his head. Depending on the legend, the horseman is either carrying his head, or missing his head altogether, and searching for it. The legend of the Headless Horseman begins in Sleepy Hollow, New York, during the American Revolutionary War. Tradition folklore holds that the horseman was a Hessian artilleryman who was killed during the Battle of White Plains, Indiana 17776. He was decapitated by an American cannonball, and the shattered remains of his head were left on the battlefield while his comrades hastily carried his body away. In myth, the horseman is known to ride along the streets looking out for any person that may be around. There he would chop off the head of his victim, where he would then put the severed head upon his own shoulders and disappear into the night, all while looking for his next victim. I don't know about you, but I am keen on keeping my head on my shoulders. Mind having a ghostly man keeping it on his. 2. The Wendigo. The Wendigo is a mythical cannibal monster or evil spirit native to the northern forests of the Atlantic coast and Great Lakes region of both the United States and Canada. The Wendigo may appear as a monster with some characteristics of a human, or as a spirit who has possessed a human being and may then become monstrous. It is historically associated with cannibalism, murder, insatiable greed, and the cultural taboos against such behaviors. In some traditions, humans who become overpowered by greed could turn into Wendigos. The myth thus served as a method of encouraging cooperation and moderation. Humans can also turn into Wendigos by being in contact with them for too long. The Wendigo was gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tightly over its bones. With its bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion the ash gray of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into their sockets. The Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton recently disinterred from the grave. Yikes, definitely not a creature you would want to stalk you when alone in the forests. 1. The Thunderbird. The Thunderbird's a legendary creature in certain North American indigenous peoples' history and culture. It is considered a supernatural being of power and strength. It is especially important, and frequently depicted, in the art, songs and oral histories of many Pacific Northwest coast cultures, but is also found in various forms among some peoples of the American Southwest, East Coast of the United States, Great Lakes, and Great Plains. The Thunderbird controls the upper world while the underworld is controlled by the underwater panther or great horned serpent. The Thunderbird throws lightning at the underwater creatures and creates thunder by flapping its wings. Thunderbirds in tradition are commonly depicted as having an X-shape appearance. Well, seeing the Thunderbird and the underwater creatures in a battle would be glorious, but being anywhere near the battle is not a place I would want to be. Think, all that lightning being thrown around is sure you will be struck and dead.
Hey guys, and welcome to another Urban Reads and Stories video. Today's video is all about those terrifying urban legends we have all heard of and hate to happen to us. This is 5 terrifying urban legends. For years, kids living in and around Staten Island raised goosebumps by relating the tale of Cropsey, a boogeyman who lived in the woods and made a nocturnal habit of disemboweling children. Parents no doubt eased their kids' fears by telling them no such monster existed. But he did. In 1987, Andre Rand was put on trial and convicted for a child abduction. Rand, it turned out, may have been connected to a rash of child disappearances in the 1970s. He had once worked at Willowbrook, a defunct mental institution. While he denies involvement in other cases, it's clear Rand's activities had a heavy influence in the word-of-mouth stories that followed. Vintage video games have long traded stories about a coin-operated arcade game circa early 1980s Portland that had strange effects on its players. The game, titled Polybius, was alleged to have prompted feelings of disorientation, amnesia, game addiction, and even suicide. The machine's cabinet was said to be painted entirely black, and it was rumored that stern-looking men would sometimes visit arcades to collect information from the machine before disappearing. Was it a CIA experiment spun up from MK-Ultra, the psychoactive drug study conducted on unsuspecting subjects? While the entire story doesn't hold up to scrutiny, individual pieces are actually based in fact. Brian Dunning, host of Skeptiad podcast, did some investigative work and found that a 12-year-old named Brian Morrow had become sickened during a 28-hour marathon video game contest in Portland in 1981. Just a few days later, Portland area arcades were raided by federal agents, who seized cabinets that were being used for gambling. Coupled with the existence of a real arcade game called Polyplay, these memories seem to amalgamate into the Polybius legend. You stagger into the bathroom at 3 a.m. to relieve yourself. Groggy you with sleep, you lift the lid and position yourself over the toilet. You hear splashing. Turning on the light, you see a rat looking back at you from the bowl. You're never the same again. Urban legends about animals in sewers have been a staple of scary stories, particularly the one about baby alligators being flushed down toilets and then growing to adult size in waste channels. Most often told in New York. But finding a rodent in your toilet, inches from very vulnerable areas of your body, is particular kind of domestic terror, and one that happens to be possible. Drain plumbing for toilets is typically 3 inches in diameter or more, plenty of space for a rat to climb up. The animals are attracted to sewage lines due to undigested food in feces and can travel through pipes before emerging through an opening and into your bathroom. And yes, rats can be somewhat testy when they complete their journey. One aquatic rodent bit the rump of a female victim in Petersburg, Virginia in 1999. In Seattle, the issue is common enough that public officials have given advice on what to do in case you encounter one: close the lid and flush. If you lived in or around Virginia in the 1970s, you were probably exposed to the story of the Bunny Man. In the tale, an escaped mental patient takes to gutting bunnies and hanging them from a bridge underpass. Later, the maniac is said to have graduated to gutting and hanging teens in a similar manner. Locals were cautioned to never be caught near the underpass, which is now known to most people as Bunny Man Bridge, on Halloween night. This story likely spawned from the very real presence of a roving madman in the area. In October 1970, a couple reported seeing a man dressed in a wild suit and wearing bunny ears who began yelling at them that they were on private land. To punctuate his point, he threw a hatchet at their windscreen, apparently shattering it. There was a second sighting of Bunny Man 2 weeks later, when a security guard spotted a hatchet-wielding man chipping away at a porch railing. Police tried, unsuccessfully, to locate then man. While he didn't disembowel anyone, the thought of an adult wielding both a hatchet and a pair of rabbit ears somehow manages to be just as disturbing. Imagine finding yourself outside and alone in the dark on a residential street. You hear footsteps approaching. Suddenly, a man with a misshapen face appears. You run, terrified beyond words. You spread the story of the man with no face throughout Pennsylvania. Charlie, No Face was actually a man named Ray Robinson, and he was no figment of anyone's imagination. Born in 1910, Robinson was disfigured as the result of an electrical accident at the age of 8. He touched active wires, which effectively maimed him. Knowing his appearance could be disconcerting, Robinson took to taking strolls after dark. He often walked a path along Route 351 in Beaver County. While his inevitably led to spreading stories about a boogeyman haunting the town. He died in 85.
Item, SCP-026. Object Class, Euclid. Special Containment Procedures, SCP-026 is to remain securely locked and boarded up at all times when there is no research ongoing. Alarms are set to alert the Foundation in case of entry by civilians or other agencies. Description: SCP-026 is a 3-story public school building built in data expunged. It has two wings connected to a central foyer. It was declared condemned in data expunged after it was found the floor plan didn't match up to the building's blueprints. See interview log 02601. It came to the Foundation's attention after several disappearances in the area were linked to visits to the abandoned building. The building demonstrates spatial anomalies. The internal space is much greater than the external of the building would allow. Hallways display variable length, while stairways have differing number of steps going up or down. The number of rooms of the hallways changes each time they are counted. Attempts at trying to reach the far ends of the hallways have met with failure so far. Entrance located at fire escapes located at the end of the hallways lead to doors approximately midway down the length of the halls. Edit, see Note 026A. There is considerable graffiti on the interior walls of the school. Most appears typical, including gang signs, names, and street art. However, the graffiti fades and reappears, changing location. Writing on chalkboards and bulletin boards changes in a similar fashion. Subjects typically found range from standard school subjects, mathematics, literature, biology, to more esoteric subjects, such as quantum entanglement, data expunged, and eugenics. One researcher reported one board detailing information about SCP data expunged, but photographic evidence showed only a blank slate. See Note 026B. The phrase "the children used to sing" has appeared multiple times in various places throughout the building, but there is currently no explanation for its significance. A number of unconscious subjects have been found in the building, mostly of high school age, ranging from 12 to 18. They are dressed in accordance to the school's dress code, circa data expunged. Several have been identified as former students or faculty of the school who disappeared after the school shut down, in at least one case, more than 10 years after the closure. It is currently unknown how they were transported back into SCP-026. See Note 026C. All attempts to wake the subjects while inside the building have failed. On being removed from the grounds of SCP-026, the subjects wake abruptly. They experience a period of confusion, before dying from extremely rapid dehydration, followed by advanced decomposition. No useful intelligence has been recovered from the subjects to date. The inability to wake subjects extends to those who fall asleep on the grounds of SCP-026. though the rapid dehydration only seems to affect those who have been found on the grounds of the school. See Incident Report 02612. Note 026A. Robotic exploration and video feeds have shown that the apparent spatial anomalies are caused by changes in the perceptions of observers, rather than actual spatial phenomena. For this reason, SCP-026 does not require the expertise of Mobile Task Force Row 8 roadside picnickers at this time. Update: further exploration has shown that some spatial phenomena do occur. See the exploration logs for more details. Note 026b. The contents of notepads, books, and pieces of paper have been observed to disappear, only to reappear on surfaces within SCP-026. New writings have appeared, mostly drawn from graffiti or textbooks. Caution should be exercised in bringing documents onto the grounds of SCP-026. Note 026c. Several Class D personnel exposed to SCP-026 have disappeared from Foundation control, only to reappear inside the anomalous building. The subjects in question had previously complained of dreams identical to those experienced by Agent Malek. Update: see Interview Log 02608. Incident Report 02612. During a routine security check of SCP-026, Agent Malek was found unconscious by his partner, Agent Jones, in the main foyer. Initial attempts at rousing Agent Malek were ineffective, so he was moved for transportation to Site Data Expunged. Upon leaving the grounds of SCP-026, he woke abruptly in a state of agitation. When questioned, he revealed that he had been dreaming of a classroom setting. This dream has been consistent throughout all subjects who have fallen asleep within the grounds of SCP-026.
Just before dawn, on the outskirts of New York Harbor, a small sloop sailed listlessly into the bay. The ship had no crew, no lights, and a deck covered in blood. It presented a mystery to the local police, who set their detectives on the case, which led to a manhunt up the east coast of the United States in pursuit of a phantom. The police may have had a description, a name, but they had no idea of the monster they would find at the end of the trail. More than a phantom, they were chasing a legend, a man who would later become whispered about in taverns as the last pirate of New York. Albert W. Hicks, also known as Elias W. Hicks, William Johnson, John Hicks, and Pirate Hicks, was a triple murderer, and one of the last people executed for piracy in the United States. Cultural historian Rich Cohen places him as the first New York City legendary gangster figure, a bridge between the piracy of old and rise of a new gangster nation. According to Hicks' testimony, he was born in 1820 in Foster, Rhode Island. His father was a farmer who had 7 sons, of whom Hicks was the second youngest. He was known to be headstrong and a fighter. He never attended school and worked on the farm until age 15, when he ran away to Norwich, Connecticut, where he began a life of crime. Arrested for theft, he was put into jail. Biographer Rich Cohen suggests it wouldn't have been uncommon for a teenage runaway to be buggered by older inmates. Hicks escaped a number of times, but he was reapprehended and given increasingly severe sentences, including a year in solitary where Hicks said he went a little crazy. He swore vengeance against the whole human race. The account given by Hicks for the next 20 years is murder and mayhem on the high seas, the goldfields of California, throughout South America, Mexico, the South Pacific, and the Atlantic Trade Triangle. Ship mutinies and highway robberies were his main occupation. It is possible that Hicks killed hundreds of people. He and an accomplice typically killed their victims and stayed on the move, spending money on alcohol, prostitutes, and fine clothes until it ran out. He was a known raconteur, and when his confessions were published, the New York Times raised some doubt about their accuracy, but modern biographer Rich Cohen said there was evidence to support at least some of the stories. Hicks eventually washed up in New York City, at the age of 40, with a newly married wife who knew nothing of his criminal past and a young child to support. Needing money for his family, he turned to the skills he knew best. Hicks hired on as a deckhand with the oyster sloop A.E. Johnson out of New York City, which he knew to be carrying a large amount of cash for buying oysters in Virginia to be transported back to New York. There were 4 men on the boat, including Captain George H. Burr, brothers Oliver and Smith Watts, and Hicks. It was nighttime as the boat neared the Narrows. Captain Burr and Oliver retired to their quarters to sleep. Smith had night duty and Hicks joined him on deck, politely taking a turn on the wheel. Hicks saw something and pointed it out to Smith, asking what it was. Smith didn't see anything. Hicks said, "Look again." Smith turned his back. Hicks grabbed a sea axe and struck a blow to the back of Smith's head, felling him to the deck. Hearing the commotion, Oliver Watts stuck his neck out through the cabin hatchway. Hicks struck again, decapitating Watts. Hicks recalled that the body slowly sagged downward and the head rolled onto the deck, now sprayed with the blood of 2 brothers. Hicks carried the bloodied axe into Captain Burr's cabin, who was by now alert. The captain was a tall, strong man and the ensuing fight lasted a while, with Burr almost strangling Hicks to death. Eventually, Hicks managed to slash the captain with the axe, slicing off half his face, including an eyeball and nose left hanging on the axe blade. Exhausted from the struggle of killing Burr, Hicks searched the living quarters for loot. When Hicks returned onto the deck, he saw a movement and was shocked to see Smith on his feet moving towards him. He believed it might be an apparition. Hicks forced the injured man overboard, but Smith grasped a rail and hung on with a death grip. Hicks swung the axe and chopped off his fingers, which fell onto the deck. The rest of Smith slipped into the water. Hicks threw the other bodies and the axe overboard. The A.E. Johnson had been running unattended and struck another ship, the schooner J.R. Mather, breaking the Johnson's mainmast and bringing down her rigging. Hicks set out to sink the ship, with the evidence of the killings, by drilling a handful of holes through the keel. He then took the money, about $230, and the possessions of the murdered crew, and abandoned ship in a yawl, rowing for shore and landing about daybreak next to a farmer's field on Staten Island just above Fort Richmond, Battery Weed. Believing that he would not be caught, he made his way back home to Manhattan, stopping at saloons merrily drinking and making a spectacle of himself. When the abandoned but still afloat A.E. Johnson was discovered the next day by the Coast Guard, they found the deck and cabin bathed in blood, including inexplicably a set of severed fingers. The city was shocked by the gruesome scene and intrigued by the mystery of what happened. Police detectives could see that a yawl was missing and began a search for it. After a few days, a local boy led them to where it had been abandoned in some rushes. They began following a chain of witnesses who had seen a strange man carrying a large heavy sea bag. The detectives followed witness sightings all the way back to an apartment in Manhattan. Hicks learned the police were on his trail through newspaper reports and fled the city. Detectives had by now determined Hicks' identity, and they continued to follow a chain of witnesses who remembered a large man with a wife and small child taking trains and boats northward. When police found the last witness to see him, a cabbie who took Hicks to a boarding home outside Providence, Rhode Island, they surrounded the house in the middle of the night and took him captive in bed without a fight. They found in his possession Captain Burr's watch, several money bags, and a daguerreotype belonging to Watts, among other damning evidence. When the abandoned but still afloat A.E. Johnson was discovered the next day by the Coast Guard, They found the deck and cabin bathed in blood, including inexplicably a set of severed fingers. The city was shocked by the gruesome scene and intrigued by the mystery of what happened. Police detectives could see that a yawl was missing and began a search for it. After a few days, a local boy led them to where it had been abandoned in some rushes. They began following a chain of witnesses who had seen a strange man carrying a large heavy sea bag. The detectives followed witness sightings all the way back to an apartment in Manhattan. Hicks learned the police were on his trail through newspaper reports and fled the city. Detectives had by now determined Hicks' identity, and they continued to follow a chain of witnesses who remembered a large man with a wife and small child taking trains and boats northward. When police found the last witness to see him, a cabbie who took Hicks to a boarding home outside Providence, Rhode Island, they surrounded the house in the middle of the night and took him captive in bed without a fight. They found in his possession Captain Burr's watch, several money bags, and a daguerreotype belonging to Watts, among other damning evidence. Hicks soon became a legend in the New York underworld, with the help of showman P.T. Barnum. Barnum had met Hicks in prison and made a deal that would allow Barnum to take a death mask while he was still alive. In return, Barnum would give Hicks a new set of clothes, the electric blue suit he wore for the execution. Barnum used the casting to create a full-size wax statue of Hicks wearing the same clothes as when he committed the murders. The wax likeness was displayed for 10 years and seen by millions of visitors before it melted in a museum fire. Biographer Rich Cohen argues that Hicks originated a gangster clothing fashion that can still be seen in art and real life. The Hicks look of a Kossuth hat pulled low over one eye, long-tailed monkey jacket, and pumped footwear were displayed at the Barnum Wax Figure Museum, where millions saw a very bad but handsome man. This style passed from gangster to gangster and through generations as a sort of badge of association with legends of the past, eventually reaching Hollywood films of the 1930s and broader culture to the present. Hicks was hanged on Friday the 13th. There is some speculation Hicks originated or helped solidify a superstition of the day's ill luck, though there are other theories. His name became a slang gambling phrase, meaning 6 on a pair of dice, rhymes with Hicks. Henry Sherman Backus, an itinerant composer of murder ballads that romanticized crimes, dedicated a ballad titled Hicks the Pirate, sung to the traditional Irish tune The Rose Tree. Irish singer-songwriter Vincent Cross recorded a modern take on the 1860 ballad for his album The Life and Times of James the Rooster Corcoran, 2020, titled Albert W. Hicks. 8-9. The execution of Albert Hicks is dramatized in Chapter 18 of McKinley Cantor's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Andersonville, 1955. Hicks was portrayed as a wax figure in the Twilight Zone episode The New Exhibit. In the show, wax figures in a museum come to life and commit murders when they learn their exhibit is to be shut down. Hicks is accurately dressed in a Kossuth hat and carries a sea axe. He is portrayed by the American actor, Bob Mitchell. Billy the Kid, born Henry McCarty, also known by the pseudonym William H. Bonney, was an Irish-American outlaw and gunfighter of the American Old West who killed 8 men before he was shot and killed at the age of 21. He also fought in New Mexico's Lincoln County War, during which he allegedly committed 3 murders. McCarty was orphaned at the age of 15. His first arrest for stealing food, at the age of 16, in late 1975. 10 days later, he robbed a Chinese laundry and was again arrested, but escaped shortly afterward. He fled from New Mexico Territory into neighboring Arizona Territory, making him both an outlaw and a federal fugitive. In 1877, McCarty began to refer to himself as William H. Bonney. 2 different versions of a wanted poster dated September 23, 1875, refer him to as William Wright, better known as Billy the Kid. After murdering a blacksmith during an altercation in August 1877, McCarty became a wanted man in Arizona and returned to New Mexico, where he joined a group of cattle rustlers. He became well known in the region when he joined the Regulators and took part in the Lincoln County War of 1978. McCarty and 2 other regulators were later charged with killing 3 men, including Lincoln County Sheriff William J. Brady and one of his deputies. McCarty's notoriety grew in December 1880 when the Las Vegas Gazette in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and the Sun in New York City carried stories about his crimes. Sheriff Pat Garrett captured McCarty later that month. In April 1881, McCarty was tried and convicted of Brady's murder and was sentenced to hang in May of that year. He escaped from jail on April 28, killing 2 more sheriff's deputies in the process and evading capture for more than 2 months. Garrett shot and killed McCarty, by then 21, in Fort Summer on July 14, 1881. During the following decades, legends grew that McCarty had survived, and a number of men claimed to be him. Billy the Kid remains one of the most notorious figures from the era, whose life and likeness have been frequently dramatized in Western popular culture. Henry McCarty was born to parents of Irish Catholic ancestry, Catherine and Patrick McCarty, in New York City. While his birth year has been confirmed as 1859, the exact date has been disputed as either September 17 or November 23 of that year. A letter from an official of St. Peter's Church in the Manhattan states it is in possession of records showing McCarty was baptized there on September 28, 1863. Following the death of her husband Patrick, Catherine McCarty and her sons moved to Indianapolis, Indiana, where she met William Henry Harrison Antrim. The McCarty family moved from Antrim to Wichita, Kansas, in 1870. After moving again a few years later, Catherine married Antrim on March 1, 1873, at the First Presbyterian Church in Santa Fe, New Mexico City Territory. McCarty and his brother Joseph were witnesses to the ceremony. Shortly afterward, the family moved from the Santa Fe to Silver City, New Mexico, and Joseph McCarty began using the name, Joseph Antrim. Shortly before McCarty's mother, Catherine, died of tuberculosis, then called consumption, on September 16, 1874, McCarty's stepfather, William Antrim, abandoned the family, leaving both McCarty boys orphans. McCarty was 15 years old when his mother died. Sarah Brown, the owner of a boarding house, gave him room and board in exchange for work. On September 16, 1875, McCarty was caught stealing food. 10 days later, McCarty and George Schaefer robbed a Chinese laundry, stealing clothing and 2 pistols. McCarty was charged with theft and was jailed. He escaped 2 days later and became a fugitive, as reported in the Silver City Herald the next day, the first story published about him. McCarty located his stepfather and stayed with him until Antrim threw him out. McCarty stole clothing and guns from him. It was the last time the two saw each other. After leaving Antrim, McCarty traveled to southeastern Arizona Territory, where he worked as a ranch hand and gambled his wages in nearby gaming houses. In 1876, he was hired as a ranch hand by well-known Henry Hooker. During this time, McCarty became acquainted with John R. Mackey, a Scottish-born criminal and former U.S. cavalry private who, following his discharge, remained near the U.S. Army post at Camp Grant. The 2 men soon began stealing horses from local soldiers. McCarty became known as Kid Antrim because of his youth, slight build, clean-shaven appearance, and personality. On August 17, 1877, McCarty was at a saloon in the village of Bonita when he got into an argument with Francis P. Windy Cahill, a blacksmith who reportedly had bullied McCarty and in turn called Cahill a son of a bitch, whereupon Cahill threw McCarty to the floor and the two struggled for McCarty's revolver. McCarty shot and mortally wounded Cahill. A witness said McCarty has no choice, he had to use his equalizer. Cahill died the following day. McCarty fled but returned a few days later and was apprehended by Miles Wood, the local justice of the peace. McCarty was detained and held in the Camp Grant guardhouse but escaped before law enforcement could arrive. McCarty stole a horse and fled Arizona Territory for New Mexico Territory, but Apaches took the horse from him, leaving him to walk many miles to the nearest settlement. At Fort Stanton in the Pecos Valley, McCarty, starving and near death, went to the home of a friend and Seven Rivers Warriors gang member John Jones, whose mother Barbara nursed him back to health. After regaining his health, McCarty went to Apache Tajo, a former Army post, where he joined a band of rustlers who raided herds owned by cattle magnate John Chisholm in Lincoln County. After McCarty was spotted in Silver City, his involvement with the gang was mentioned in local newspapers. At some point in 1877, McCarty began to refer to himself by the name William H. Bonney. After returning to New Mexico, McCarty worked as a cowboy for English businessman and rancher John Henry Tunstall, near the Rio Felix, a tributary of the Rio Grande, in Lincoln County. Tunstall and his business partner and lawyer Alexander Lawrence Murphy, James Dolan, and John Riley. The three men had wielded an economic and political hold over Lincoln County since the early 1970s, due in part to their ownership of a beef contract with nearby Fort Stanton and a well-patronized dry goods store in the town of Lincoln. By February 1878, McCarty owed £8,000 to Dolan, who obtained a court order and asked Lincoln County Sheriff William J. Brady to attack nearly $40,000 worth of Tunstall's property and livestock. Tunstall put Bonney in charge of non-prime horses and told him to relocate them to his ranch for safekeeping. Meanwhile, Sheriff Brady assembled a large posse to seize Tunstall's cattle. On February 18, 1878, Tunstall learned of the posse's presence on his land and rose out to intervene. During the encounter, one member of the posse shot Tunstall in the chest, knocking him off his horse. Another posse member took at Tunstall's gun and killed him with a shot to the back of his head. Tunstall's mother ignited the conflict between the two factions that became known as the Lincoln County War. After Tunstall was killed, McCarty and Dick Brewer swore affidavits against Brady and those in his posse, and obtained murder warrants from Lincoln County Justice of the Peace John B. Wilson. On February 20, 1878, while attempting to arrest Brady, the sheriff and his deputies found and arrested McCarty and two other men riding with him. Deputy U.S. Marshal Robert Weidenman, a friend of McCarty, and a detachment of soldiers captured Sheriff Brady's jail guards, put them behind bars, and released Bonney and Brewer. McCarty then joined the Lincoln County Regulators. On March 9 they captured Frank Baker and William Morton, both of whom were accused of killing Tunstall. Baker and Morton were killed while allegedly trying to escape. On April 1, the Regulators ambushed Sheriff Brady and his deputies. McCarty was wounded in the thigh during the battle. Brady and Deputy Sheriff George W. Hindman were killed. On the morning of April 4, 1878, Buckshot Roberts and Dick Brewer were killed during a shootout at Blazer's Mill. Warrants were issued for several participants on both sides, and McCarty and two others were charged with killing Brady, Hindman, and Roberts. On the night of Sunday, July 14, McSween and the Regulators, now a group of 50 or 60 men, went to Lincoln and stationed themselves in the town among several buildings. At the McSween residence were McCarty, Florencio Chavez, Jose Chavez y Chavez, Jim French, Harvey Morris, Tom O'Folliard, and Gino Salazar, among others. Another group led by Marin Chavez and Doc Skurlock positioned themselves on the roof of a saloon. Henry Newton Brown, Dick Smith, and George Coe defended a nearby adobe bunkhouse. On Tuesday, July 16, newly appointed Sheriff George Pepin sent sharpshooters to kill the McSween defenders at the saloon. Pepin's men retreated when one of the snipers, Charles Crawford, was killed by Fernando Herrera. Pepin then sent a request for assistance to Colonel Nathan Dudley, commandant of nearby Fort Stanton. In a reply to Pepin, Dudley refused to intervene but later arrived in Lincoln with troops, turning the battle in favor of the Murphy-Dolan faction. A shooting war broke out on Friday, July 19. McSween's supporters gathered inside his house. When Buck Powell and Deputy Sheriff Jack Long set fire to the building, the occupants began shooting. McCarty and the other men fled the building when all rooms but one were burning. During the confusion, Alexander McSween was shot and killed by Robert W. Beckwith, who was then shot and killed by McCarty. McCarty and 3 other survivors of the Battle of Lincoln were near the Mescalero Indian Agency when the agency bookkeeper, Morris Bernstein, was murdered on August 5, 1878. All 4 were indicted for the murder, despite conflicting evidence that Bernstein had been killed by Constable Ignacio Martinez. All of the indictments, except McCarty's, were later quashed. On October 5, 1878, U.S. Marshal John Sherman informed newly appointed territorial governor and former Union Army General Lew Wallace that he held warrants for several men, including William H. Antrim, alias Kidd, alias Bonnie, but was unable to execute them owing to the disturbed condition of affairs in that county, resulting from acts of a desperate class of men. Wallace issued an amnesty proclamation on November 13, 1878, which pardoned anyone involved in the Lincoln County War since Tunstall's murder. It specifically excluded persons who had been convicted of or indicted for a crime, and therefore excluded McCarty. On February 18, 1879, McCarty and friend Tom O'Folliard were in Lincoln and watched as attorney Houston Chapman was shot and his corpse set on fire. According to eyewitnesses, the pair were innocent bystanders forced at gunpoint by Jesse Evans to witness the murder. McCarty wrote to Governor Wallace on March 13, 1879, with an offer to provide information of the Chapman murder in exchange for amnesty. On March 15 Governor Wallace replied, agreeing to a secret meeting to discuss the situation. McCarty met with Wallace in Lincoln on March 17, 1879. During the meeting and subsequent correspondence, Wallace promised McCarty protection from his enemies and clemency if he would offer his testimony to a grand jury. On March 20, Wallace wrote to McCarty, to remove all suspicion of understanding, I think it better to put the arresting party in charge of Sheriff Kimbrell, who shall be instructed to see that no violence is used. McCarty responded on the same day, agreeing to testify and confirming Wallace's proposal for his arrest and detention in a local jail to assure his safety. On March 21, McCarty let himself be captured by a posse led by Sheriff George Kimball of Lincoln County. As agreed, McCarty provided a statement about Chapman's murder and testified in court. However, after McCarty's testimony, the local district attorney refused to set him free. Still in custody several weeks later, McCarty began to suspect Wallace had used subterfuge and would never grant him amnesty. McCarty escaped from the Lincoln County Jail on June 17, 1879. McCarty avoided further violence until January 10, 1880, when he shot and killed Joe Grant, a newcomer to the area, at Hargrove Saloon in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. According to contemporary sources, McCarty had been warned Grant intended to kill him. He walked up to Grant, told him he admired his revolver, and asked to examine it. Grant handed it over. Before returning the pistol, which he noticed contained only 3 cartridges, McCarty positioned the cylinders so the next hammerfall would land on an empty chamber. Grant suddenly pointed his pistol at McCarty's face and pulled the trigger. When it failed to fire, McCarty drew his own weapon and shot Grant in the head. A reporter for the Las Vegas Octet quoted McCarty as saying the encounter was a game of 2 and I got there first. In 1880, McCarty formed a friendship with a rancher named Jim Greathouse, who later introduced him to Dave Rudabaugh. On November 29, 1880, McCarty, Rudabaugh, and Billy Wilson ran from a posse led by Sheriff's Deputy James Carlisle. Cornered at Greathouse's ranch, McCarty told the posse they were holding Greathouse as a hostage. Carlisle offered to exchange places with Greathouse, and McCarty accepted the offer. Carlace later attempted to escape by jumping through a window, but he was shot 3 times and killed. The shootout ended in a standoff. The posse withdrew and McCarty, Rudabaugh, and Wilson rode away. A few weeks later, after the Great House incident, McCarty, Rudabaugh, O'Folliard, Charlie Bouger, and Tom Pickett rode into Fort Summer. Unbeknownst to McCarty and his companions, a posse led by Parr Garrett was waiting for them. The posse opened fire, killing O'Folliard. The rest of the outlaws escaped unharmed. On December 13, 1880, Governor Wallace posted a $500 bounty for McCarty capture. Pat Garrett continued his search for McCarty. On December 23, following the siege in which Bouger was killed, Garrett and his posse captured McCarty along with Pickett, Rudabaugh, and Wilson at Stinking Springs. The prisoners, including McCarty, were shackled and taken to Fort Summer, then later to Las Vegas, New Mexico. When they arrived on December 26, they were met by crowds of curious onlookers. The following day, an armed mob gathered at the train depot before the prisoners, who were already on board the train with Garrett, departed for Santa Fe. Deputy Sheriff Romero, backed by the angry group of men, demanded custody of Dave Rudabaugh, who during an unsuccessful escape attempt on April 5, 1880, shot and killed Deputy Antonio Lino Valdez in the process. Garrett refused to surrender the prisoner, and a tense confrontation ensued until he agreed to let the sheriff and 2 other men accompany the party to Santa Fe, where they would petition the governor to release Rudabaugh to them. In a later interview with a reporter, McCarty said he was unafraid during the incident, saying, "If I only had my Winchester I'd lick the whole crowd." The Las Vegas Gazette ran a story from a jailhouse interview following McCarty's capture. When the report said Bonnie appeared relaxed, he replied, "What's the use of looking on the gloomy side of everything? The laugh's on me this time." During his short career as an outlaw, McCarty was the subject of numerous U.S. newspaper articles, some as far away as New York. After arriving at Santa Fe, McCarty, seeking clemency, sent Governor Wallace 4 letters over the next 3 months. Wallace refused to intervene, and McCarty went to trial in April 1881 in Mesilla, New Mexico. Following 2 days of testimony, McCarty was found guilty of Sheriff Brady's murder. It was the only conviction secured against any of the combatants in the Lincoln County War. On April 13, Judge Warren Bristol sentenced McCarty to hang, with his execution scheduled for May 13, 1881. According to legend, upon sentencing, the judge told McCarty he was going to hang until he was dead, dead, dead. McCarty's response was, "You can go to hell, hell, hell." According to the historical record, he did not speak after the reading of his sentence. Following his sentence, McCarty was moved to Lincoln, where he was held under guard on the top floor of the town courthouse. On the evening of April 28, 1881, while Garrett was in White Oaks collecting taxes, Deputy Bob Ollinger took 5 other prisoners across the street for a meal, leaving James Bell, another deputy, alone with McCarty at the jail. McCarty asked to be taken outside to use the outhouse behind the courthouse. On their return to the jail, McCarty, who was walking ahead of Bell up the stairs to his cell, kid around a blind corner, slipped out of his handcuffs and beat Bell with the loose end of the cuffs. During the ensuing scuffle, McCarty grabbed Bell's revolver and fatally shot him in the back as Bell tried to get away. McCarty, with his legs still shackled, broke into Garrett's office and took a loaded shotgun left behind by Ollinger. McCarty waited at the upstairs window for Ollinger to respond to the gunshot that killed Bell and called out to him, "Look up, old boy, and see what you get." When Ollinger looked up, Bonnie shot and killed him. After about an hour, McCarty freed himself from the leg irons with an axe. He obtained a horse and rode out of town. According to some stories, he was singing as he left Lincoln. While McCarty was on the run, Governor Wallace placed a new $500 bounty on the fugitive's head. Almost 3 months after his escape, Garrett, responding to rumor that McCarty was in the vicinity of Fort Sumner, left Lincoln with 2 deputies on July 14, 1881, to question resident Pete Maxwell, a friend of McCarty's. Maxwell, son of land baron Lucien Maxwell, spoke with Garrett the same day for several hours. Around midnight, the pair sat in Maxwell's darkened bedroom when McCarty unexpectedly entered. Accounts vary. After the shooting, a local justice of the peace assembled a coroner's jury of 6 people. The jury members interviewed Maxwell and Garrett, and McCarty's body and the location of the shooting were examined. The jury certified the body of McCarty and, according to a local newspaper, the jury foreman said, "It was the kid's body that we examined. McCarty was given awake by candlelight. He was buried the next day and his grave denoted with a wooden marker." 5 days after McCarty's killing, Garrett traveled to Santa Fe, New Mexico, to collect the $500 reward offered by Governor Lew Wallace for his capture, dead or alive. William G. Rich, the acting New Mexico governor, refused to pay the reward. Over the next few weeks, the residents of Las Vegas, Mesilla, Santa Fe, White Oak, and other New Mexico cities raised over $7,000 in reward money for Garrett. A year and 4 days after McCarty's death, the New Mexico Territorial Legislature passed a special act to grant Garrett the $500 reward promised by Governor Wallace. Because people had begun to claim Garrett unfairly ambushed McCarty, Garrett felt the need to tell his side of the story and called upon his friend, journalist Marshall Upson, to ghostwrite a book for him. The book, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, was first published in April 1882. Although only a few copies sold following its release, in time, it became a reference for later historians who wrote about McCarty's life. Over time, legends grew that McCarty was not killed and that Garrett staged the incident and death out of friendship so that McCarty could evade the law. During the next 50 years, a number of men claimed they were Billy the Kid. Most of these claims were easily disproven, but have remained topics of discussion and debate. In 1948, a Central Texas man, Ollie P. Roberts, also known as Brushy Bill Roberts, began claiming that he was Billy the Kid and went before New Mexico Governor Thomas J. Mabry seeking a pardon. Mabry dismissed Roberts' claim, and Roberts died shortly afterward. Nevertheless, Hyco, Texas, Roberts' town of residence, capitalized on his claim by opening a Billy the Kid museum. John Miller, an Arizona man, also claimed he was McCarty. This was unsupported by his family until 1938, sometime after his death. Miller's body was burned in the state-owned Arizona Pioneers Home Cemetery in Prescott, Arizona. In May 2005, Miller's teeth and bones were exhumed and examined, without permission from the state. DNA samples from the remainder were sent to a laboratory in Dallas and tested to compare Miller's DNA with blood samples obtained from floorboards in the old Lincoln County Courthouse and a bench where McCarty's body was allegedly placed after he was shot. According to a July 2015 article in the Washington Post, the lab results were useless. In 2004, researchers sought to exhume the remains of Catherine Antrim, McCarty's mother, whose DNA would be tested and compared with that of the body buried in William Bonney's grave. As of 2012, her body had not been exhumed. In 2007, author and amateur historian Gail Cooper files a lawsuit against the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office under the State Inspection of the Public Records Act to produce records of the results of the 2006 DNA tests and other forensic evidence collected in the Billy the Kid investigations. In April 2012, 133 pages of documents were provided. They offered no conclusive evidence confirming or disproving the generally accepted story of Garrett's killing of McCarty, but confirmed the existence of the record, and that they could have been produced earlier. In 2004, Cooper was awarded $100,000 in punitive damages, but the decision was later overturned by the New Mexico Court of Appeals. The lawsuit ultimately cost Lincoln nearly $300,000. In February 2015, Historian Robert Stahl petitioned a district court in Fort Sumner asking the state of New Mexico to issue a death certificate for McCarty. In July 2015, Stahl filed suit in the New Mexico Supreme Court. The suit asked the court to order the state's Office of the Medical Investigator to officially certify McCarty's death under New Mexico state law.
Item, SCP-023. Object Class, Euclid. Special Containment Procedures, SCP-023 is to be contained in a walled-off intersection of two corridors at site data expunged, with at least 3 meters of space in each direction, and full stores at 3 of the 4 ends, in addition to the real door. Security cameras will be placed and maintained above all 4 doors. At all times, SCP-023's eye sockets are to be filled with spherical inserts made of hard rubber. Eye inserts must be replaced as they degrade. Degradation can be monitored by measuring the brightness of the burning effect as observed by security footage. Brightness greater than 12 candela requires that the inserts be replaced within 12 hours. Eye inserts are only to be replaced individually, and only after the sun has completely set. Personnel are not to look directly into eye sockets of SCP-023 at any time. Following Incident 02327, all reflective surfaces, including displays, monitors, and eyewear of any sort are not permitted within 30 meters of SCP-023's cell. This includes monitors linked to security cameras within its enclosure. Security personnel posted at checkpoints outside both corridors will enforce and adhere to this measure. Experimentation involving SCP-023 has been suspended indefinitely. Description: SCP-023 is a large, sexless shaggy canine, 1.5 meters at the shoulder, with black fur data expunged. See Incident Report 02326. Anytime an individual makes eye contact with SCP-023, either that person or a member of their immediate family will die exactly 1 year after eye contact is broken. Research into the method of selection is incomplete due to a moratorium on experiments, but the available data suggests that having a larger immediate family lessens the chance of the individual making eye contact themselves dying, and neither a pattern nor a preference in victim types have been found. This may indicate that SCP-023's victim is designated entirely at random, but it is unknown whether this selection occurs at the beginning or at the end of the 1-year time period. Attempts to terminate an individual who has made eye contact with SCP-023 and their entire immediate family before the 1-year time period has ended. Data expunged. Autopsies of individuals killed by SCP-023's effect show that, while outwardly appearing unharmed, their remains have been filled in with highly compacted ash, including but not limited to all organ systems and the circulatory system. Muscle tissue, bones, and brain tissue universally show signs of exposure to temperatures above data expunged. If not contained in a setting that at least superficially resembles a crossroads, SCP-023 will phase through walls to get to the nearest suitable location, incinerating all materials it passes through. SCP-023 was first brought to the Foundation's attention when it attacked a church in data expunged while it was in session, killing data expunged civilians directly and, reducted, as a result of eye contact. Following retrieval of SCP-023, Class P amnesiacs were administered to all witnesses and surviving victims. The incident was covered up as a case of arson. Addendum 023001 SCP-023 broke containment on data expunged by passing through its cell wall, Incident 02301. SCP-023 was later discovered at the intersection of two corridors elsewhere on site. Data expunged. Agent Data Expunged noted SCP-023's similarity to a redacted Special Containment Procedures for SCP-023 updated. Assistant Researcher Data Expunged issued a reprimand for negligence. Addendum 023002. SCP-023 has been responsible for the deaths of data expunged personnel and data expunged civilians since it was first brought into containment on 10/12/data expunged. Addendum 023003. Request for reclassification to Keter pending. Addendum 023004. Due to both anomalies focusing on specific geographic spaces, their destructive capabilities, and canine appearance, it is possible that SCP-1111-1 may be a variant of the same phenomenon observed in SCP-023, or vice versa. Investigation into the origin of both anomalies is ongoing. Due to the inability to capture SCP-1111-1 for study, investigations are currently focused on SCP-023.
Everyone knows about the legend of Bloody Mary. You stand in the mirror with all the lights off and then you call her name while looking into the mirror 3 times, more depending on which part of the world you are from. Bloody Mary then would appear in front of you, and depending on how your future looks, she would either tell you your future or she would kill you and destroy your life. However, this story is not about Bloody Mary but another soul you can summon in the same way but using black candles and calling a different name. However, this soul is not a soul but a demon who will, depending on how evil it is feeling, will rip your soul from your body or buy your soul for whatever your heart desires. I was in university in the summer of 2000 and I was taking a course on the supernatural, ghosts, demons and spirits. That sort of stuff. One of the most popular urban legend that popped up in class was that of Bloody Mary. Even before I went to college or even school, I have heard of Bloody Mary. Me and my friends would tell stories of how we would look into the mirror with 2 white candles on either side and call out Mary's name. We would then make up stories of how she appeared to us and tell us how future and how rich we would be or how influential we could be. However, that was it all, just stories that kids made up to impress each other. With me now being in university and hearing about Bloody Mary, I got bored and fed up of hearing and writing about the legend. One semester, we was tasked on looking up a not so well-known legend and writing an essay about it. This got me very excited as I already known about the popular legends and it gave me a chance to seek our new and unknown legends. It was however going to be very tricky as there ain't going to be much info out there. I was scouring the internet for hours looking for the right legend to write about, but when it seems like I have found a legend, a little search on the web and it brings up more info about the legend. I was gutted to say the least. Now with the web out of the question, I sat and pondered for a while, thinking to myself, is there anywhere I could go that could point me to a legend that is not on the web and not so popular? I thought about going to the library and having a look to see what stories I could find about legends, but then I thought to myself that these books are also written by people who have done research on the net, and by doing so, they would also write about the most popular legends too. This was coming to a standstill. It was really doing my head in. I thought I would forget about this for a while and have a walk around town center. Maybe something would pop into my head, or maybe even I would see something. So here I am wandering around taking in the views of the town center and also window shopping. I see an old antique bookstore across the road. Maybe, just maybe, they have what I am looking for, I thought to myself. However, I was getting a tad hungry and thought that before I went to the bookstore, I should go and get a bite to eat and calm the pain that is hunger in my stomach. It was perfect, a cafe just across the road from the bookstore. I went into the cafe and made the order of pancakes and bacon with some maple syrup and a nice large cup of coffee. I was there for an hour eating while also looking at the bookstore. To say I was now really intrigued. I got up from my seat at the cafe and left a nice tip for the waitress who served me. After all, the service was great and the food was really good. I went across the street and into the old bookstore. Now inside, I was really impressed. The store looked like a library with shelves from top to bottom. There was also a section at the back where it seemed there was even older books. These books, however, was under lock and key, with the key being kept in a safe behind the shop counter. I decided that I would take a look from the front of the shop to the back of the shop. There were some nice books in the store, I must say, a lot of first editions on sale but with a hefty price tag. Still thought I couldn't find anything I was looking for. That was when I decided that I would go to the back of the store where all the other books was locked up. I was starting to lose the will to live. I couldn't find anything, and then there, near the bottom of the bookcase, I saw it. A book that read rare and uncommon urban legends. It piqued my interest and I must have it. However, the price tag on that book was way more than I would make in a year. I stood there for a while pondering while looking at the book. That is when the storekeeper saw me and came over. "I see you like this book," he said to me. "Yes, I love urban legends and need to write an essay on an unknown legend," I replied to him. "I see," he said while I turned and looked at him. He seemed to stand there for a little while thinking about something. "I tell you what, as long as you stay in the store, then I will let you read the book and choose whatever legend you want out of it to write about it," he told me. I looked at him surprised but happy he would let me do that. The store was closing in 10 minutes, so I couldn't quite stay in the store and study. I made arrangements with the storekeeper to come back after university and look over the book. I was really hoping it had something that would hook me. I made my way back to the store after university to look the book over. When I got into the store, I can see the man had took the book out of the bookshelf and laid on the table near the till ready for me to look over. I thank the man once again for letting me have the chance to look over the book. I then take a seat at the table, take out some pen and paper to take notes. I grab the book with caution and start to turn its pages. This book was indeed magnificent. Every page I look at an urban legend that I have never heard of before. This book was indeed a needle in a haystack. I turned the pages looking for that one story. Halfway through the book, I land a page that I thought was perfect. However, I heard of a similar legend before. Having a little time to myself to think, I got it. I remember why this story sounded so familiar. This story was very near the same to the legend of Bloody Mary, only there are differences. The story was called Bloody Lucifer. Intriguing, I thought to myself. You summon Lucifer the same way you would with Bloody Mary, however you light 2 black candles instead of white candles, and then also there is his name. Reading up and taking notes on the story, I got an idea in my head. A really stupid idea that I should have not acted upon, but I needed to know. I also thought that it would be stupid and that it would never happen. After I have taken all the notes, I packed my stuff, thanks the shopkeeper, and went down the road a few yards. There was also a pagan shop on the same side of the road that sold all sorts to do with the witching hour, and so I knew they would have some black candles. I picked up 2 black candles, but also thinking about it, I also picked up a few religious items, holy water, cross and a Bible. Even thought I knew nothing would happen. I wanted to make sure that I was ready for whatever happened. After my purchase, I hurried back to my dorm room and set up in the bathroom. I knew that in the bathroom I had no window and so it would be quite dark in there. I put the black candles on either side of the mirror and also laid the religious items on the counter behind me but under a towel. I then light the 2 candles and turned on the light. The only thing I could see was my light reflection in the mirror. The instructions in the book told me that I would have to say his name 5 times and he should appear before me. I took a stance in front of the mirror, took a deep breath and slowly said Bloody Lucifer, Bloody Lucifer, Bloody Lucifer, Bloody Lucifer, Bloody Lucifer. After the 5th time I stopped but got gutted. I knew it. Then out of nowhere a gust of wind blew out the candles and a horrid apparition appeared in the mirror. I must have turned white as a ghost. Who is it that summons me? What is it that you want? Speak now and sell me your soul, it spoke. I got very scared. I could think of what to do. I now had a demon in my mirror and it wanted my soul. I then remember something else in the book. So I took action. I took out the white candles and put them either side of the mirror while discarding the black candles. What do you think you are doing? That will not work, the voice said, but I refused to listen and continued. I light the candles and proceeded to say his name backward 5 times. This made the demon go back to hell. I then turned on the light, sprayed the mirror with holy water and took it off the wall. I went into my room and looked for some twine. I knew I had some. I then proceeded to tie the cross and Bible to the mirror and hid it in the basement of our building where no one could find it. As for the black candles, they went into the bin. As for the legend, folks, always heed warnings from the books that you read. You never know when a legend can be true or not.
So this happened some time ago, a few hundred years give or take a decade. I will not go into it much, but we all know how the urban legend happens. You stand in front of the mirror with the lights off, sometimes with candles, other times without candles. Anyway, you repeat the name Bloody Mary 5 times, and when you come to turn on the light, then she appears in the mirror and attacks and steals your soul. However, this story is not about that Bloody Mary but a different character in which she would use an enchanted song to steal sleeping children from their bed. She would then soak in the blood as she believed that this would rejuvenate her and make her young again, in which she believed she would become immortal and would be able to live till the end of time by soaking her in the innocent blood of children. I have no idea if there is any merit to this story, as I was not around during those times. However, we have a museum that is dedicated to her witchcraft. In the museum, there was items from her house, cauldron, furniture, clothes and also a painting. It is said that anyone who stares at the eyes of those paintings will become cursed and live a horrid life. So let's get on to the story. There was this old hag that lived in tiny rundown cottage deep in the forest. In her spare time, she would sell herbal remedies. Folks living in the town nearby would call her Bloody Mary, as they believed she was a witch. None dared to cross the old hag as they feared their cattle would go dry, their food store would rot away before the winter season, and their children would take sick of fever, or any other terrible things that an angry witch could do to her neighbors. Then the little girls in the village began to disappear one by one. No one could find out where they had gone. Grief-stricken families searched the woods, the local buildings, and all the houses and barns, but there was no sign of the missing girls. A few brave souls even went to Bloody Mary's home in the woods to see if the witch had taken the girls, but she denied any knowledge of the disappearances. Still, it was noted that her haggard appearance had changed. She looked younger and more attractive. The neighbors were suspicious, but they could find no proof the witch had taken their young ones. Then came a night when the daughter of the miller rose from her bed and walked outside, following an enchanted sound no one else could hear. The miller's wife had toothache and was sitting up in the kitchen treating the tooth with a herbal remedy when her daughter left the house. She screamed for her husband and followed the girl out of the door. The miller came running in his nightshirt. Together, they tried to restrain the girl, but she kept breaking away from them and heading out of town. The desperate cries of the miller and wife woke the neighbors. They came to assist the frantic couple. Suddenly, a sharp-eyed farmer gave a shout and pointed towards a strange light at the end of the woods. A few townsmen followed him out into the field and saw Bloody Mary standing beside a large oak tree, holding a magic wand that was pointed towards Miller's house. She was glowing with an unearthly light as she set her evil spell upon the miller's daughter. The townsmen grabbed their guns and their pitchforks and ran towards the witch. When she heard the commotion, Bloody Mary broke off her spell and fled back into the woods. The far-sighted farmer had loaded his gun with silver bullets in case the witch ever came after his daughter. Now he took aim and shot at her. The bullet hit Bloody Mary in the hip and she fell to the ground. The angry townsmen leapt upon her and carried her back into the field, where they built a huge bonfire and burned her at the stake. As she burned, Bloody Mary screamed a curse at the villagers. If anyone mentioned her name aloud before a mirror, she would send her spirit to revenge herself upon them for her terrible death. When she was dead, the villagers went to the house in the wood and found unmarked graves of the little girls the evil witch had murdered. She used their blood to make her young again. From that day to this, anyone foolish enough to chant Bloody Mary's name 3 times before a darkened mirror will summon the vengeful spirit of the witch. It is said that she will tear their bodies to pieces and rip the souls from their mutilated bodies. The souls of these unfortunate ones will burn in torment as Bloody Mary once was burned, and they will be trapped forever in the mirror of her domain.
Robert Leroy Parker, April 13, 1866, November 7, 1908, better known as Butch Cassidy, was an American train and bank robber and the leader of a gang of criminal outlaws known as the Wild Bunch in the Old West. Parker engaged in criminal activity for more than a decade at the end of the 19th century, but the pressures of being pursued by law enforcement, notably the Pinkerton Detective Agency, forced him to flee the country. He fled with his accomplice Harry Alonzo Longabaugh, known as the Sundance Kid, and Longabaugh's girlfriend Etta Place. The trio traveled first to Argentina and then to Bolivia, where Parker and Longabaugh are believed to have been killed in a shootout with the Bolivian army in November 1908. The exact circumstances of their fate continue to be disputed. Parker's life and death have been extensively dramatized in film, television, and literature, and he remains one of the most well-known icons of the Wild West mythos in modern times. Robert Leroy Parker was born on April 13, 1866, in Beaver, Utah Territory, the first of 13 children of British immigrants Maximilian Parker and Anne Campbell Gillies. The Parker and Gillies families had converted to the Mormon faith while still living in the United Kingdom. Maximilian Parker was 12 years old when his family arrived in Salt Lake City in 1856 as Mormon pioneers. Anne Gillies was born and lived in Tyneside in northeast England before immigrating to the U.S. with her family in 1859 at age 14. The couple was married in July 1865. Robert Parker grew up on his parents' ranch near Circleville, about 215 miles, 346 kilometers, south of Salt Lake City. Parker fled his home as a teenager, and while working on a dairy ranch, met cattle thief Mike Cassidy. He subsequently worked on several ranches, in addition to a brief apprenticeship with a butcher in Rock Springs, Wyoming, where he got his nickname, by the word butcher, which morphed later into Butch, to which he soon added the last name Cassidy in honor of his old friend and mentor. Butch Cassidy's first criminal offense was minor. Around 1880, he journeyed to a clothier's shop in another town but found it closed. He broke into the shop and stole a pair of jeans and some pie, leaving an IOU promising to pay on his next visit. The clothier pressed charges, but Cassidy was acquitted by a jury. He continued to work on ranches until 1884, when he moved to Telluride, Colorado, ostensibly to seek work, but perhaps to deliver stolen horses to buyers. Cassidy led a cowboy's life in Wyoming and Montana before returning to Telluride in 1887, where he met Matt Warner, the owner of a racehorse. Cassidy and Warner raced the horse at various events, dividing the winnings between them. 1889 to 1895. Cassidy's first bank robbery took place on June 24, 1889, when Warner, two of the McCarty brothers, and robbed the San Miguel Valley Bank in Telluride. Businessman L.L. Nunn had taken a controlling interest in the bank the previous year. The robbers stole around $21,000, equivalent to $598,000 in 2019, after which they fled to the Robbers' Roost, a remote hideout in southeastern Utah. In 1890, Cassidy purchased a ranch on the outskirts of Du Bois, Wyoming. This location is across the state from the notorious Hole in the Wall, a natural geological formation, and a popular hideout for outlaw gangs, including Cassidy's, during the era. Cassidy's ranching was possibly a facade for clandestine activities, perhaps with hole-in-the-wall outlaws, as he was never financially successful at ranching. Cassidy's ranch used the unmistakable brand of Reverse E, Box, E. In early 1894, Cassidy became involved romantically with the rancher and outlaw Ann Bassett. Her father was a rancher who did business with Cassidy, supplying him with fresh horses and beef. That same year, Cassidy was arrested at Lander, Wyoming, for stealing horses and possibly for running a protection racket among the local ranchers there. He was imprisoned in the Wyoming State Prison in Laramie, where he served 18 months of a 2-year sentence. He was released and pardoned in January 1896 by Governor William Alfred Richards. He became involved briefly with Bassett's older sister Josie before returning to Ann. Cassidy associated with a wide circle of criminals, most notably his closest friend William Ellsworth Elzile, Harvey Kid Curry Logan, Ben Kilpatrick, Harry Tracy, Will Noose Carver, Laura Bullion, and George Flatnose Curry, who collectively became the so-called Wild Bunch. The gang assembled sometime after Cassidy's release from prison in 1896, and took its name from the Doolin Dalton Gang, also known as the Wild Bunch. On August 13, 1896, Cassidy, Leigh, Logan, and Bob Meeks robbed the bank at Montpelier, Idaho, escaping with roughly $7,000. Cassidy recruited Harry Alonzo Longabaugh, also known as the Sundance Kid, into the gang soon after. Bassett, Leigh, and Leigh's girlfriend Maud Davis all joined Cassidy at Robbers' Roost in early 1897. The four hid there until early April when Leigh and Cassidy sent the women home so that the men could plan their next robbery. They ambushed a small group of men carrying the payroll of the Pleasant Valley Coal Company in the mining town of Castlegate, Utah, on April 22, 1897, stealing a sack containing $7,000 in gold, with which they fled back to the Robbers' Roost. On June 2, 1899, the gang robbed a Union Pacific Overland Flyer passenger train near Wilcox, Wyoming, a robbery that earned them a great deal of notoriety and resulted in a massive manhunt. Many notable lawmen took part in the hunt, but they did not find them. Kid Curry and George Curry had a shootout with lawmen following the train robbery, killing Sheriff Joe Hazen. Tom Horn, a killer for hire employed by the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, was told by explosives expert Bill Speck about the Hazen shooting. Pinkerton detective Charlie Siringo was then assigned the task of capturing the outlaws. He became friends with Elfie Longiski, who was using the last name Curry after becoming pregnant by Kid Curry's brother Lonnie Logan, and Siringo intended to locate the gang through her. On July 11, 1899, Lay and others were involved in a Colorado and Southern Railroad train robbery near Folsom, New Mexico, which Cassidy might have planned and personally directed. A shootout ensued with local law enforcement, during which Lay killed Sheriff Edward Farr and Henry Love. Lay was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment at the New Mexico State Penitentiary. The Wild Bunch typically separated following a robbery and fled in different directions, later reuniting at a predetermined location such as the Hole in the Wall, Robber's Roost, or Fanny Porter's brothel in San Antonio. Cassidy approached Utah Governor Heber Wells to negotiate an amnesty. Wells advised him to ask the Union Pacific Railroad to drop their criminal complaints against him, and Union Pacific Chairman E. H. Harriman attempted to meet with Cassidy through Warner. On August 29, 1900, Cassidy, Longabaugh, and others robbed Union Pacific Train No. 3 near Tipton, Wyoming, breaking Cassidy's earlier promise to the governor of Wyoming and ending any chance for amnesty. 1901. On February 28, 1900, Lawman attempted to arrest Lonnie Logan at his aunt's home. Lonnie was killed in the shootout that followed, and his cousin Bob Lee was arrested for rustling and sent to prison in Wyoming. On March 28, George Curry and News Carver were pursued by a posse from St. John's, Apache County, Arizona, after using currency they had stolen in the Wilcox train robbery. The posse engaged them in a shootout, during which deputies Andrew Gibbons and Frank Lesueur were killed, while Carver and Curry escaped. On April 17, George Curry was killed in a shootout with Grand County, Utah, Sheriff John Tyler, and Deputy Sam Jenkins. On May 26, Kid Curry rode into Moab, Utah, and killed both Tyler and Jenkins in another shootout in retaliation for the deaths of George and Lonnie. In December, Cassidy posed alongside Longabaugh, Logan, Carver, and Ben Kilpatrick in Fort Worth, Texas, for the now famous Fort Worth 5 photograph. The Pinkerton agency obtained a copy of the photograph and began to use it for wanted posters. On July 3, 1901, Kid Curry and a group of men robbed a Great Northern train near Wagner, Montana, stealing more than $60,000 in cash, equivalent to $1,840,000 in 2019. The gang split up, but a posse led by Sheriff Elijah Bryant caught up with News Carver and killed him. Kilpatrick was captured in St. Louis on November 5 at Josie Blakey's resort on Chestnut Street. In his pocket, they found a key to a room at the Lockleed Hotel. The next morning, they found Laurel Bullion in the lobby, checking out with her luggage. In her valise was $8,500 in unsigned banknotes from the Great Northern robbery. Curry killed Knoxville policemen William Dinwiddie and Robert Saylor in another shootout on December 13, then escaped. He returned to Montana, pursued by Pinkertons and other law enforcement officers, where he shot and killed rancher James Winters in retaliation for killing his brother Johnny years before. Cassidy and Longabaugh fled to New York City, feeling continuous pressure from the numerous law enforcement agencies pursuing them and seeing their gang falling apart. They departed from there to Buenos Aires, Argentina aboard the British steamer Herminius on February 20, 1901, along with Longabaugh's companion Etta Place. Cassidy posed as James Ryan, Place's fictitious brother. They settled in a 4-room log cabin on a 15,000-acre ranch that they purchased on the east bank of the Rio Blanco near Calilla, just east of the Andes in the Chubut. Two English-speaking bandits held up the Banco de Tarapaco y Argentino in Rio Gallegos on February 14, 1905, 700 miles south of Calilla near the Strait of Magellan, and the pair vanished north across the Patagonian grasslands. Cassidy and Longabaugh sold the Calilla ranch on May 1, fearing that law enforcement had located them. The Pinkerton agency had known their location for some time, but the snow and the hard winter of Patagonia had prevented their agent Frank de Mayo from making an arrest. Governor Julio Lozano issued an arrest warrant, but Sheriff Edward Humphreys, a Welsh Argentine who was friendly with Cassidy and enamored of place, tipped them off. The trio then fled north to San Carlos de Bariloche, where they embarked on the steamer Condor across Nahuel Lake and into Chile. They returned to Argentina by the end of the year. Cassidy, Longabaugh, Place, and an unknown male associate robbed the Banco de la Nación Argentina branch in Villa Mercedes on December 19, 400 miles west of Buenos Aires, taking 12,000 pesos. They fled across the Andes to reach the safety of Chile. On June 30, 1906, Place decided that she had enough of life on the run, so Longabaugh took her back to San Francisco. Cassidy obtained honest work under the alias James Santiago Maxwell at the Concordia tin mine in the Santa Vera Cruz range of the central Bolivian Andes, where Longabaugh joined him upon his return. Their main duties included guarding the company payroll. The two traveled to Santa Cruz in late 1907, a frontier town in Bolivia's eastern savanna, still wanting to settle down as respectable ranchers. A courier was carrying the payroll for the Armeo Franquia and CIA silver mine on November 3, 1908, near the small mining town of San Vicente in southern Bolivia, when he was attacked by two masked American bandits believed to be Cassidy and Longabaugh. Witnesses saw them 3 days later in San Vicente, where they lodged in a small boarding house owned by miner Bonifacio Casasola. Casasola became suspicious of them because they had a mule from the Armeo mine, identifiable from the company's brand. He notified a nearby telegraph officer, who notified the Ibarra cavalry regiment stationed nearby. The unit dispatched 3 soldiers under the command of Captain Justo Concha, and they notified the local authorities. The soldiers, the police chief, the local mayor, and some of his officials all surrounded the lodging house on the evening of November 6, intending to arrest the Armeo robbers. As they approached the house, the bandits opened fire, killing one of the soldiers and wounding another, and starting a gunfight which lasted for several hours into the evening and the night. At around 2 a.m., during a lull in the fighting, the mayor heard a man scream 3 times inside the house, then 2 successive shots were fired from inside the house. The authorities entered the house the next morning, where they found 2 bodies with numerous bullet wounds to the arms and legs. The man assumed to be Longabaugh had a bullet wound in the forehead, and the man thought to be Cassidy had a bullet hole in the temple. The local police report speculated that judging from the positions of the bodies, Cassidy had probably shot the fatally wounded Longabaugh to put him out of his misery, then killed himself with his final bullet. The Tupiza police identified the bandits as the men who robbed the Armeo payroll transport, but the Bolivian authorities did not know their real names, nor could they positively identify them. The 2 bodies were buried at the small San Vicente cemetery, near the grave of a German miner named Gustav Zimmer. American forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow and his researchers attempted to find the graves in 1991, but they did not find any remains with DNA matching the living relatives of Cassidy and Longabaugh. In 2017, a new search was launched for Cassidy's grave, which zeroed in on a mine outside Good Springs, Nevada. The dig found human remains, but they did not match the DNA provided. John McPhee's Annals of the Former World repeats a story that Dr. Francis Smith told to geologist David Love in the 1930s. Smith stated that he had seen Cassidy, who told him that his face had been altered by a surgeon in Paris, and he showed Smith an old bullet wound that Smith recognized as work that he had done. Josie Bassett claimed in 1960 that Cassidy came to visit her in the 1920s after returning from the South America, and that he died in Johnny, Nevada about 15 years ago. Residents in Cassidy's hometown of Circleville, Utah, claimed in an interview that he worked in Nevada until his death. Western historian Charles Kelly observed in his 1938 book The Outlaw Trail, A History of Butch Cassidy and His Wild Bunch, it seems exceedingly strange that Cassidy never returned to Circleville, Utah, to visit his father if he were still alive. According to his great-nephew, Bill Bettinson, he did return to Utah to visit his family in Circleville many times. Bruce Chatwin, in his classic travel book In Patagonia, says, I went to see the Star Witness, his sister, Mrs. Lulu Sick, Parker Bettinson, a forthright and energetic woman in her 90s, she has no doubts. Her brother came back and ate blueberry pie with family at Circleville in 1925. She believes he died of pneumonia in Washington in the late 1930s. An episode of the television series In Search of 1978 examined the claims and possible evidence for Cassidy's return to America during the 1920s in a series of interviews with residents of Baggs, Wyoming, a popular destination for the Wild Bunch during their raiding years. Residents claimed that Cassidy had visited for several days in 1924. Driving a Ford Model T. Bettinson stated that he returned to the family home in Circleville during this period, and picked up his brother Mark in a Ford, then drove to their father's home, where she also lived. Her father allegedly said to her, I'll bet you don't know who this is. This is your brother Robert Leroy. She stated that Cassidy was full of regrets, particularly at having disappointed his mother. She quoted him lamenting, all I did is make a wreck of my life. Bettinson claims that Cassidy lived out his years in the Northwest and died in 1937 and that the family had agreed not to disclose his final resting place, since they had chased him all his life, and now he's going to rest in peace. This story is also recounted by W.C. Jameson in Butch Cassidy, Beyond the Grave, referencing the 1975 book Bettinson co-authored with Dora Flack, Butch Cassidy, My Brother. On an episode of the series Mission Declassified, 2019, investigative journalist Christoph Putzel met with local researcher Marilyn Grace at Cassidy's childhood log cabin on the Parker Ranch in Circleville to talk about the alleged burial of Cassidy there on July 20, 1937. Grace explains that Cassidy was secretly buried at Tom's Cabin, a former sheepherder's log cabin located in a remote area of the property, a favorite camping spot for his brothers and him. Grace says an eyewitness, neighbor D. Crosby, saw the burial take place at the cabin. Earlier, Putzel spoke to Alda Orton, another Parker neighbor, who described the family as having been dressed in funeral-like attire on that same day. Grace goes on to say that cadaver dogs had been brought to the cabin in an attempt to locate remains and lead to a positive indication. The underside of the cabin was later dug and two bones discovered, identified as a human spinal bone and a toe bone. Putzel head forensic scientist Susanna Ryan at Pure Gold Forensics in Redlands, California conducted DNA test on the bones. Ryan confirmed they were human, but lacked enough DNA for a complete profile. As the site may have become public knowledge, the Parker family is believed to have since excavated Cassidy's remains at the cabin and moved them to a different burial site, leaving the spinal and toe bones behind in the process. Spring-heeled Jack is an entity in English folklore of the Victorian era. The first claimed sighting of spring-heeled Jack was in 1937, later sightings were reported all over Great Britain and were especially prevalent in suburban London, the Midlands, and Scotland. There are many theories about the nature of spring-heeled Jack. This urban legend was very popular in its time, due to the tales of his bizarre appearance and ability to make extraordinary leaps, to the point that he became the topic of several works of fiction. Which, some writers have argued, formed the foundation of the later legend of spring-heeled Jack. The most important of early entities was the Hammersmith ghost, which in 1803 and 1804 was reported in Hammersmith on the western fringes of London. It would later reappear in 1824. Another apparition, the Southampton ghost, was also reported as assaulting individuals in the night. This particular spirit bore many characteristics of spring-heeled Jack and was reported as jumping over houses and being over 10 feet tall. The first alleged sighting of Spring-Heeled Jack was made in London in 1837, and the last reported sighting is said in most of the secondary literature to have been made in Liverpool in 1904. According to many later accounts, in October 1837 a girl by the name of Mary Stevens was walking to Lavender Hill, where she was working as a servant, after visiting her parents in Battersea. On her way through Clapham Common, a strange figure leaped at her from a dark alley. After immobilizing her with a tight grip of his arms, he began to kiss her face, while ripping off her clothes and touching her flesh with his claws, which were, according to her deposition, cold and clammy as those of a corpse. In a panic, the girl screamed, making the attacker quickly flee from the scene. The commotion brought several residents who immediately launched a search for the aggressor, but he could not be found. The next day, the leaping character is said to have chosen a very different victim near Mary Stevens' home, inaugurating a method that would reappear in later reports. He jumped in the way of a passing carriage, causing the coachman to lose control, crash and severely injure himself. Several witnesses claimed that he escaped by jumping over a 9-foot-high wall while cackling with a burst of high-pitched, ringing laughter. Gradually, the news of the strange character spread, and soon the press and the public gave him the name Spring-Heeled Jack. A few months after these first sightings, on January 9, 1938, the Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Cowan, revealed at a public session held in the Mansion House as an anonymous complaint that he had several days earlier, which he had withheld in the hope of obtaining further information. The correspondent, who signed the letter, a resident of Peckham, wrote, "It appears that some individuals have laid a wager with a mischievous and foolhardy companion, that he durst not take upon himself the task of visiting many of the villages near London in 3 different disguises, a ghost, a bear, and a devil, and moreover, that he will not enter a gentleman's gardens for the purpose of alarming the inmates of the house. The wager has, however, been accepted, and the unmanly villain has succeeded in depriving 7 ladies of their senses, 2 of whom are not likely to recover but to become burdens to the families. At one house the man rang the bell, and on the servant coming to open the door, this worse than brute stood in no less dreadful figure than a spectre clad most perfectly. The consequence was that the poor girl immediately swooned, and has never from that moment been in her senses. The affair has now been going on for some time, and, strange to say, the papers are still silent on the subject. The writer has reason to believe that they have the whole history at their finger ends but, through interested motives, are induced to remain silent." Though the Lord Mayor seemed fairly skeptical, a member of the audience confirmed that servant girls about Kensington, Hammersmith, and Ealing, tell a dreadful story of this ghost or devil. The matter was reported in the Times on 9th January, other national papers on 10th January and, on the day after that, the Lord Mayor showed a crowded gathering a pile of letters from various places in and around London complaining of similar wicked pranks. The quantity of letters that poured into the Mansion House suggests that the stories were widespread in suburban London. One writer said several women in Hammersmith had been frightened into dangerous fits and some severely wounded by a sort of claws the miscreant wore on his hands. Another correspondent claimed that in Stockwell, Brixton, Camberwell and Vauxhall several people had died of fright and others had fits. Meanwhile, another reported that the trickster had been repeatedly seen in Lewisham and Blackheath. The Lord Mayor himself was in 2 minds about the affair. He thought the greatest exaggerations had been made, and that it was quite impossible that the ghost performs the feats of a devil upon the earth, but on the other hand someone he trusted had told him of a servant girl at Forest Hill who had been scared into fits by a figure in a bear's skin. He was confident the person or persons involved in this pantomime display would be caught and punished. The police were instructed to search for the individual responsible, and rewards were offered. A peculiar report from the Brighton Gazette, which appeared in the April 14, 1838 edition of the Times, related how a gardener in Rosehill, Sussex, had been terrified by a creature of known nature. The Times wrote that Spring-Heeled Jack has, it seems, found his way to the Sussex coast, even though the report bore little resemblance to other accounts of Jack. The incident occurred on 13th of April, when it appeared to a gardener in the shape of a bear or some other four-footed animal. Having attracted the gardener's attention by a growl, it then climbed the garden wall and ran along with it on all fours, before jumping down and chasing the gardener for some time. After terrifying the gardener, the apparition scaled the wall and made its exit. Perhaps the best known of the alleged incidents involving Spring-Heeled Jack were the attacks on two teenage girls, Lucy Scales and Jane Alsop. The Alsop report was widely covered by the newspapers, including a piece in the Times, while fewer reports appeared in relation to the attack on Scales. The press coverage of these two attacks helped to raise the profile of Spring-Heeled Jack. Jane Alsop also reported that on the night of 19th of February 1838, she answered the door of her father's house to a man claiming to be a police officer, who told her to bring a light, claiming "We caught Spring-Heeled Jack here in the lane." She brought the person a candle and noticed that he wore a large cloak. The moment she handed him the candle, however, he threw off the cloak and presented a most hideous and frightful appearance, vomiting blue and white flames from his mouth while his eyes resembled red balls of fire. Miss Alsop reported that he wore a large helmet and that his clothing, which appeared to be very tight-fitting, resembled white oilskin. Without saying a word he caught hold of her and began tearing her gown with his claws. She was rescued by one of her sisters, after which her assailant fled. On 28th of February 1838, 9 days after the attack on Miss Alsop, 18-year-old Lucy Scales and her sister were returning home after visiting their brother, a butcher who lived in a respectable part of Limehouse. Miss Scales stated in her deposition to the police that as she and her sister were passing Dragon Alley, they observed a person standing in an angle of the passage. She was walking in front of her sister at the time, and just as she came up to the person, who was wearing a large cloak, he spurted a quantity of blue flame in her face, which deprived her of her sight, and so alarmed her, that she instantly dropped to the ground, and was seized with violent fits which continued for several hours. Her brother added that on the evening in question, he had heard a loud scream of one of his sisters moments after they left his house, and on running up Green Dragon Alley he found his sister Lucy on the ground in a fit, with his sister attempting to hold and support her. She was taken home, and he then learned from his other sister what had happened. She described Lucy's assailant as being tall, thin, and gentlemanly appearance, covered in a large cloak, and carrying a small lamp or bullseye lantern similar to those used by the police. The individual did not speak nor did he try to lay hands on them, but instead walked quickly away. Every effort was made by the police to discover the author of these and similar outrages, and several persons were questioned, but were set free. The Times reported the alleged attack on Jane Alsop on 2nd of March 1838 under the heading "The Late Outrage at Old Ford 2." This was followed with an account of the trial of one Thomas Milbank, who, immediately after the reported attack on Jane Alsop, had boasted in the Morgan's Arms that he was Spring-Heeled Jack. He was arrested and tried at Lambeth Street Court. The arresting officer was James Lee, who had earlier arrested William Corder, the Red Barn murderer. Milbank had been wearing overalls and a greatcoat, which he dropped outside the house, and the candle he dropped was also found. He escaped conviction only because Jane Alsop insisted her attacker had breathed fire, and Milbank admitted he could do no such thing. Most of the other accounts were written long after the date. Contemporary newspapers do not mention them. After these incidents, Spring-Heeled Jack became one of the most popular characters of the period. His alleged exploits were reported in the newspapers and became the subject of several penny dreadful and plays performed in the cheap theaters that abounded at the time. The devil was even renamed Spring-Heeled Jack in some Punch and Judy shows, as recounted by Henry Mayhew in his London Labour and the London Poor. This here is Satan, we might say the devil, but that ain't right and gentlefolk don't like such words. He is now commonly called Spring-Heeled Jack or the Russian Bear, that's since the war. But, even as his fame was growing, reports of Spring-Heeled Jack appearances became less frequent if more widespread. In 1843, however, a wave of sightings swept the country again. A report from Northamptonshire described him as the very image of the devil himself, with horns and eyes of flame, and in East Anglia reports of attacks on drivers of mail coaches became common. In July 1847 a Spring-Heeled Jack investigation in Teignmouth, Devon led to a Captain Finch being convicted of 2 charges of assault against women, during which he is said to have been disguised in a skin coat, which had the appearance of bullock's hide, skullcap, horns and mask. The legend was linked with the phenomenon of the devil footprints which appeared in Devon in February 1855. At the beginning of the 1870s, Spring-Heeled Jack was reported again in several places distant from each other. In November 1877, the News of the World reported that Peckham was in state of commotion owing to what is known as the Peckham ghost, a mysterious figure, quite alarming in appearance. The editorial pointed out that it was none other than Spring-Heeled Jack, who terrified a past generation. Similar stories were published in the Illustrated Police News. In April and May 1873, it reported there were numerous sightings in Sheffield of the Park ghost, which locals came to identify as Spring-Heeled Jack. This news was followed by more sightings, until in August 1877 one of the most notable reports about Spring-Heeled Jack came from a group of soldiers in Aldershot's barracks. This story went as follows: a sentry on duty at the North Camp peered into the darkness, his attention attracted by a peculiar figure advancing towards him. The soldier issued a challenge, which went unheeded, and the figure came up beside him and delivered several slaps to his face. A guard shot at him, with no visible effect. Some sources claim that the soldier may have fired blanks at him, others that he missed or fired warning shots. The strange figure then disappeared into the surrounding darkness with astonishing bounds. Lord Ernest Hamilton's 1922 memoir 40 Years On mentions the Aldershot appearance of Spring-Heeled Jack. However, he says that they occurred in the winter of 1879 after his regiment, the 60th Rifles, had moved to Aldershot, and that similar appearances had occurred when the regiment was barracked at Colchester in the winter of 1878. He adds that the panic became so great at Aldershot that sentries were issued ammunition and ordered to shoot the night terror on sight, following which the appearances ceased. Hamilton thought that the appearances were actually pranks, carried out by one of his fellow officers, Lieutenant Alfrey. However, there is no record of Alfrey ever being court-martialed for the offense. In the autumn of 1877, Spring-Heeled Jack was reportedly seen at Newport Arch in Lincolnshire, wearing a sheepskin. An angry mob supposedly chased him and cornered him, and as in Aldershot a while before, residents fires at him to no effect. He said to have made use of his leaping abilities to lose the crowd and disappear once again. By the end of the 19th century, the reported sightings of Spring-Heeled Jack were moving towards the northwest of England. Around 1888, in Everton, North Liverpool, he allegedly appeared on the rooftop of St. Francis Xavier's Church in Salisbury Street. In 1904 there were reports of appearances nearby William Henry Street. The vast urban legend built around Spring-Heeled Jack influenced many aspects of Victorian life, especially in contemporary popular culture. For decades, especially in London, his name was equated with the bogeyman, as a means of scaring children into behaving by telling them if they were not good. Spring-Heeled Jack would leap up and peer in at them through their bedroom windows, by night. However, it was in fictional entertainment where the legend of Spring-Heeled Jack exerted the most extensive influence, owing to his allegedly extraordinary nature. 3 pamphlet publications, purportedly based on the real events, appeared almost immediately, during January and February 1938. They were not advertised as fiction, though they likely were at least partly so. The only known copies were reported to have perished when the British Library was hit during the Blitz, but their catalogue still lists the first one. The character was written into a number of penny dreadful stories during the latter half of the 19th century, initially as a villain and then increasingly heroic roles. By the early 1900s he was being represented as a costumed, altruistic avenger of wrongs and protector of the innocent, effectively becoming a precursor to the pulp fiction and then comic book superheroes. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes or H. Holmes, was an American serial killer. While he confessed to 27 murders, he was convicted and sentenced to death for only one murder, that of accomplice and business partner Benjamin Pitezel. Despite his confession of 27 murders after the Pitezel trial awaiting execution, it's speculated that Holmes may have killed as many as 200 people. Victims were killed in a mixed-use building which he owned in Chicago, located about 3 miles west of the 1839 World's Fair, Columbian Exposition, supposedly called the World's Fair Hotel, though evidence suggests the hotel portion was never truly open for business. Besides being a serial killer, Holmes was also a con artist and a trigamist, the subject of more than 50 lawsuits in Chicago alone. Holmes was executed on May 7, 1896, 9 days before his 35th birthday. Holmes was born as Herman Webster Mudgett in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, United States, on May 16, 1861, to Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodate Page Price, both of whom were descended from the first English immigrants in the area. Mudgett was his parents' third-born child. He had an older sister Mary. Holmes' father was from a farming family, and at times he worked as a farmer, trader, and house painter. His parents were devout Methodists. Late attempts to fit Holmes into the patterns seen in modern serial killers have described him torturing animals and suffering from abuse at the hands of a violent father, but contemporary and eyewitness accounts of his childhood do not provide proof of either. At the age of 16, Holmes graduated from Phillips Exeter Academy and took teaching jobs in Gilmanton and later in nearby Alton. On July 1878, he married Clara Lovering in Alton. Their son, Robert Lovering Mudgett, was born on February 3, 1880, in Loudon, New Hampshire. As an adult, Robert became a certified public accountant and served as city manager of Orlando, Florida. Holmes enrolled in the University of Vermont in Burlington, at age 18, but was dissatisfied with the school and left after 1 year. In 1882, he entered the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery and graduated in June 1884 after passing his exams. While enrolled, he worked in the anatomy lab under Professor Herdman, then the chief anatomy instructor. Holmes had apprenticed in New Hampshire under Nahum White, a noted advocate of human dissection. Years later, when Holmes was suspected of murder and claimed to be nothing but an insurance fraudster, he admitted to using cadavers to defraud life insurance companies several times in college. Housemates described Holmes as treating Clara violently, and in 1884, before his graduation, she moved back to New Hampshire and later wrote she knew little of him afterwards. After he moved to Moores Forks, New York, a rumor spread that Holmes had been seen with a little boy who later disappeared. Holmes claimed the boy went back to his home in Massachusetts. No investigation took place and Holmes quickly left town. He later traveled to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania and got a job as a keeper at Norristown State Hospital, but quit after a few days. He later took a position at a drugstore in Philadelphia, but while he was working there, a boy died after taking medicine that was purchased at the store. Holmes denied any involvement in the child's death and immediately left the city. Right before moving to Chicago, he changed his name to Henry Howard Holmes to avoid the possibility of being exposed by victims of his previous scams. In his confession after his arrest, Holmes claimed he had killed his former medical school classmate, Robert Leacock, in 1886 for insurance money. Leacock, however, died in Watford, Ontario, in Canada on October 5, 1889. In late 1886, while still married to Clara, Holmes married Myrta Belknap in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He filed for divorce from Clara a few weeks after marrying Myrta, alleging infidelity on her part. The claims could not be proven and the suit went nowhere. Surviving paperwork indicated she probably was never even informed of the suit. In any case, the divorce was never finalized. It was dismissed June 4, 1891, on the grounds of want of prosecution. Holmes had a daughter with Myrta, Lucy Theodate Holmes, who was born on July 4, 1889, in Englewood, Chicago, Illinois. As an adult, Lucy became a public school teacher. Holmes lived with Myrta and Lucy in Wilmette, Illinois, and spent most of his time in Chicago tending to business. Holmes married Georgiana Yoke on January 17, 1894, in Denver, Colorado, while still married to both Clara and Myrta. Holmes arrived in Chicago in August 1886, which is when began using the name H. H. Holmes. He came across Elizabeth S. Holton's drugstore at the northwest corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 64 RD Street in Englewood. Holton gave Holmes a job, and he proved to be a hard-working employee, eventually buying the store. Although several books portray Holton's husband as an old man who quickly vanished along with his wife, Dr. Holton was a fellow Michigan alumnus in Englewood throughout Holmes' life and survived well into the 20th century. It is a myth that they were killed by Holmes. Holmes purchased an empty lot across from the drugstore, where construction began in 1887 for a two-story mixed-use building, with apartments on the second floor and retail spaces, including a new drugstore, on the first. When Holmes declined to pay the architects or the steel company, Etna Iron and Steel, they sued in 1888. In 1892, he added a third floor, telling investors and suppliers he intended to use it as a hotel during the upcoming World Columbian Exposition, though the hotel portion was never completed. Furniture suppliers found Holmes was hiding their materials, for which he had never paid, in hidden rooms and passages throughout the building. There were soundproofed rooms and mazes of hallways, some of which seemed to go nowhere. Many of the rooms were outfitted with chutes that would drop straight down to the basement where Holmes had acid vats, quicklime, and a crematorium to dispose of his victims' bodies. Their search made the news, and investors for the planned hotel pulled out of the deal when a jeweler in the building showed them the articles. The hotel was gutted by a fire started by a known arsonist shortly after Holmes was arrested, but was largely rebuilt and used as a post office until 1938. In 1892, the hotel was somewhat completed, with 3 stories and a basement. The first floor was the storefront. The second story consisted of his elaborate torture rooms, which contained a chute that led to the basement. The third floor held more apartment rooms. In 1894, some police officers inspected the hotel while Holmes was out. During the inspection, they found rooms with hinged walls and false partitions, rooms linked with secret passages, and even airtight rooms that were connected to pipelines filled with gas which Holmes used as gas chambers. Holmes would use chutes to deliver the bodies to the basement, and once there, he made use of surgical tables and an array of medical tools to dissect them before selling their organs and bones on the black market and to medical institutions. One of Holmes' early murder victims was his mistress, Julia Smythe. She was the wife of Ned Connor, who had moved into Holmes' building and began working at his pharmacy's jewelry counter. After Connor found out about Smythe's affair with Holmes, he quits his job and moved away, leaving Smythe and her daughter Pearl behind. Smythe gained custody of Pearl and remained at the hotel, continuing her relationship with Holmes. Julia and Pearl disappeared on Christmas Eve of 1891, and Holmes later claimed she had died during an abortion, though what truly happened to the two was never confirmed. Another likely Holmes paramour, Emmeline Sigrand, began working in the building in May 1892 and disappeared that December. Another woman who vanished, Edna Van Tassel, is also believed to have been among Holmes' victims. While working in the Chemical Bank building on Dearborn Street, Holmes met and became close friends with Benjamin Pitezel, a carpenter with a criminal past who was exhibiting, in the same building, a coal bin he had invented. Holmes used Pitezel as his right-hand man for several criminal schemes. A district attorney later described Pitezel as a Holmes tool. His creature. In early 1893, a one-time actress named Minnie Williams moved to Chicago. Holmes claimed to have met her in an employment office, though there were rumors he had met her in Boston years earlier. He offered her a job at the hotel as his personal stenographer and she accepted. Holmes persuaded Williams to transfer the deed to her property in Fort Worth, Texas, to a man named Alexander Bond, an alias of Holmes. In April 1893, Williams transferred the deed, with Holmes serving as the notary. The next month, Holmes and Williams, presenting themselves as man and wife, rented an apartment in Chicago's Lincoln Park. Minnie's sister, Annie, came to visit, and in July, she wrote to her aunt that she planned to accompany brother Harry to Europe. Neither Minnie nor Annie were seen alive after July 5, 1893. Holmes had an entrepreneurial spirit. Based on his former medical education and his connections, he was able to sell skeletons to medical labs and schools. He, and sometimes a hired assistant, was accused of stripping the flesh of bodies, dissecting them, and preparing the viable skeletons. The rest of the remains would be tossed in pits of lime or acid, effectively breaking down the remaining evidence. With insurance companies pressing to prosecute Holmes for arson, Holmes left Chicago in July 1894. He reappeared in Fort Worth, where he had inherited property from the Williams sisters, located at the intersection of modern-day Commerce Street and 2nd Street. There, he sought to construct another castle along the lines of his Chicago operation, once again swindling a number of suppliers. In July 1894, Holmes was arrested and briefly jailed for the first time, on the charge of selling mortgaged goods in St. Louis, Missouri. He was promptly bailed out, but while in jail he struck up a conversation with a convicted outlaw named Marion Hedgepeth, who was serving a 25-year sentence. Holmes had concocted a plan to swindle an insurance company out of $10,000 by taking out a policy on himself and then faking his death. Holmes promised Hedgepeth a $500 commission in exchange for the name of a lawyer who could be trusted. Holmes was directed to a young St. Louis attorney named Jephthah Howe. Howe was in practice with his older brother, Alfonso Howe, who had no involvement with Holmes or Pitezel or their fraudulent activities. Jephthah Howe, however, found Holmes' scheme brilliant. Nevertheless, Holmes' plan to fake his own death failed when the insurance company became suspicious and refused to pay. Holmes did not press the claim. Instead, he concocted a similar plan with Pitezel. Pitezel agreed to fake his own death so that his wife could collect on a $10,000 life insurance policy, which she was to split with Holmes and Jephthah Howe. The scheme, which was to take place in Philadelphia, called for Pitezel to set himself up as an inventor under the name B.F. Parry, and then be killed and disfigured in a lab explosion. Holmes was to find an appropriate cadaver to play the role of Pitezel. Instead, Holmes killed Pitezel by knocking him unconscious with chloroform and setting his body on fire with the use of benzene. In his confession, Holmes implied Pitezel was still alive after he used the chloroform on him, prior to being set on fire. However, forensic evidence presented at Holmes's later trial showed chloroform had been administered after Pitezel's death, presumably to fake suicide to exonerate Holmes, should be charged with murder. Holmes collected the insurance payout on the basis of the genuine Beitzel corpse. Holmes then went on to manipulate Beitzel's unsuspecting wife into allowing 3 of her 5 children, Alice, Nee, and Howard, to be in his custody. The eldest daughter and the baby remained with Mrs. Beitzel. Holmes and the 3 remaining Beitzel children traveled throughout the northern United States and into Canada. Simultaneously, he escorted Mrs. Beitzel along a parallel route, all the while using various aliases and lying to Mrs. Beitzel concerning her husband's death, claiming he was hiding out in London, as well as lying to her about the true whereabouts of her 3 missing children. In Detroit, just prior to entering Canada, they were only separated by a few blocks. In an even more audacious move, Holmes was staying at another location with his wife, who was unaware of the whole affair. Holmes would later confess to murdering Alice and Nellie by forcing them into a large trunk and locking them inside. He drilled a hole in the lid of the trunk and put on the end of a hose through the hole, attaching the other end to a gas line to asphyxiate the girls. Holmes buried their nude bodies in the cellar of his rental house at 16 St. Vincent Street, having long since been realigned into a part of Bay Street. Frank Geyer, a Philadelphia police detective assigned to investigate Holmes and find the 3 missing children, found the decomposed bodies of the 2 Beitzel girls in the cellar of the Toronto home. Detective Geyer wrote, "The deeper we dug, the more horrible the odor became, and when we reached a depth of 3 feet, we discovered what appeared to be the bone of a forearm of a human being." Geyer then went to Indianapolis, where Holmes had rented a cottage. Holmes was reported to have visited a local pharmacy to purchase the drugs which he used to kill young Howard Beitzel, and a repair shop to sharpen the knives he used to chop up the body before he burned it. The boy's teeth and bits of bone were discovered in the Holmes chimney. Holmes's murder spree finally ended when he was arrested in Boston on November 17, 1894, after being tracked there from Philadelphia by the Pinkertons. He was held on an outstanding warrant for horse theft in Texas, as the authorities had become more suspicious at this point, and Holmes appeared poised to flee the country in the company of his unsuspecting wife. Following the discovery of Alice and Nellie's body, in July 1895, Chicago police and reporters began investigating Holmes' building in Englewood, now locally referred to as the Castle. Though many sensational claims were made, no evidence was found which could have convicted Holmes in Chicago. According to Caesar, stories of torture equipment found in the building are 20th-century fiction. In October 1895, Holmes was put on trial for the murder of Benjamin Beitzel, and was found guilty and sentenced to death. By then, it was evident Holmes had also murdered the 3 missing Beitzel's children. Following his conviction, Holmes confessed to 27 murders in Chicago, Indianapolis, and Toronto, and 6 attempted murders. Holmes was paid $7,500 by the Hearst newspapers in exchange for his confession, which quickly found to be mostly nonsense. Holmes gave various contradictory accounts of his life, initially claiming innocence and later that he was possessed by Satan. His propensity for lying has made it difficult for researchers to ascertain the truth on the basis of his statements. While writing his confessions in prison, Holmes mentioned how drastically his facial appearance had changed since his imprisonment. He described his new, grim appearance as gruesome and taking a Satanist cast, and wrote he was now convinced that after everything he had done, he was beginning to resemble the devil. On May 7, 1896, Holmes was hung at Moyamensing Prison, also known as Philadelphia County Prison, for the murder of Beitzel. Until the moment of his death, Holmes remained calm and amiable, showing very few signs of fear, anxiety, or depression. Despite this, he asked for his coffin to be contained in cement and buried 10 feet deep, because he was concerned grave robbers would steal his body and use it for dissection. Holmes's neck did not snap, he instead strangled to death slowly, twitching for over 15 minutes before being pronounced dead 20 minutes after the trap had been sprung. On New Year's Eve 1909, Hedgepeth, who had been pardoned for informing Holmes, was shot and killed by police officer Edward Juburek during a hold-up at a Chicago saloon. On March 1914, the Chicago Tribune reported that, with the death of Patrick Quinlan, the former caretaker of the castle. The mystery of Holmes' castle would remain unexplained. Quinlan had committed suicide, taking strychnine. His body was found in his bedroom with a note that read, "I couldn't sleep." Quinlan's surviving relatives claimed he had been haunted for several months and was suffering from hallucinations. The castle itself was mysteriously gutted by fire in August 1895. According to a newspaper clipping from the New York Times, 2 men were seen entering the back of the building between 8 and 9 p.m. About half an hour later, they were seen exiting the building and rapidly running away. Following several explosions, the castle went up in flames. Afterward, investigators found half-empty gas can underneath the back steps of the building. The building survived the fire and remained in use until it was torn down in 1938. The site is occupied by the Englewood branch of the United States Postal Service. In 2017, amid allegations Holmes had in fact escaped execution, Holmes's body was exhumed for testing led by Janet Monge of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Due to his coffin being contained in cement, his body was found not to have decomposed normally. His clothes were almost perfectly preserved and his mustache was found to be intact. The body was positively identified by his teeth as being that of Holmes. Holmes was then reburied. The case was notorious in its time and received publicity in the international press. Interest in Holmes' crimes was revived in 2003 by Eric Larson's The Devil in the White City, Murder, Magic, and Madness at the Fair That Changed America, a best-selling non-fiction book that juxtaposed an account of the planning and staging of the World's Fair with Holmes' story. His story had been chronicled in The Torture Doctor by David Franke. The Scarlet Mansion by Alan W. Eckert and Depraved, The Shocking True Story of America's First Serial Killer by Harold Schechter, as well as The Monster of 63rd Street chapter in Gem of the Prairie, An Informal History of the Chicago Underworld by Herbert Esbury. The 1974 novel America Gothic by horror writer Robert Bloch was fictionalized version of the story of H. H. Holmes. Caesar's comprehensive 2017 biography, H. H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, attempted to separate fact from fiction and to trace how the story grew. In 2017, History aired 8 episodes of limited documentaries entitled American Ripper, in which Holmes' great-great-grandson Jeff Mudgett, along with former CIA analyst Amaryllis Fox, investigated clues to prove that Holmes was also the infamous London serial killer Jack the Ripper. In 2018, horror writer Sarah Tantlinger published The Devil's Dreamland, poetry inspired by H. H. Holmes, which won the 2018 Bram Stoker Award for Best Poetry Collection. As of 2019, an adaptation of The Devil in the White City with Martin Scorsese and Leonardo DiCaprio attached as executive producers are in development with Paramount TV and Hulu. Though it was initially reported in 2015 to be a feature film starring DiCaprio, once Hulu agreed to a partnership with Paramount, the project was announced as a series with no confirmation as to whether Scorsese and DiCaprio would actually direct and star in it, respectively. As of 2020, production has yet to commence. Theodore Robert Bundy was an American serial killer who kidnapped, raped, and murdered numerous young women and girls during the 1970s and possibly earlier. After more than a decade of denials, before his execution in 1989, he confessed to 30 homicides that he committed in 7 states between 1974 and 1978. The true number of victims is believed to be higher. Bundy was regarded as handsome and charismatic, traits that he exploited to win the trust of victims and society. He would typically approach his victims in public places, feigning injury or disability, or impersonating an authority figure, before knocking them unconscious and taking them to secluded locations to rape and strangle them. He sometimes revisited his victims, grooming and performing sexual acts with the decomposing corpses until putrefaction and destruction by wild animals made any further interactions impossible. He decapitated at least 12 victims and kept some of the severed heads as mementos in his apartment. On a few occasions, he broke into dwellings at night and bludgeoned his victims as they slept. In 1975, Bundy was jailed for the first time in Utah for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. He then became a suspect in a progressively longer list of unsolved homicides in several states. Facing murder charges in Colorado, he engineered 2 dramatic escapes and committed further assaults in Florida, including 3 murders, before his ultimate recapture in 1978. For the Florida homicides, he received 3 death sentences and 2 trials. Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison in Rayford, Florida, on January 24, 1989. Biographer Ann Rule, who had previously worked with Bundy, described him as a sadistic sociopath who took pleasure from another human's pain and the control he had over his victims, to the point of death, and even after. Bundy once called himself the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet. Attorney Polly Nelson, a member of his last defense team, wrote that Bundy was the very definition of heartless evil. Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, to Eleanor Louise Cowell at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. His father's identity has never been confirmed. His birth certificate is said to assign paternity to a salesman and Air Force veteran named Lloyd Marshall, though other accounts state his father is listed as unknown. Louise claimed she had been seduced by an old money war veteran named Jack Worthington, and the King County Sheriff's Office has him listed as the father in their files. Some family members have expressed suspicions that Bundy might have been fathered by Louise's own violent, abusive father, Samuel Cowell, but no material evidence has ever been cited to support this. For the first 3 years of his life, Bundy lived in the Philadelphia home of his maternal grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, who raised him as their own son to avoid the social stigma that accompanied birth outside of wedlock. Family, friends, and even young Ted were told that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister. He eventually discovered the truth, although he had varied recollections of the circumstances. He told a girlfriend that a cousin showed him a copy of his birth certificate after calling him a bastard, but he told biographers Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth that he found the certificate himself. Biographer and true crime writer Ann Rule, who knew Bundy, expressed a lifelong resentment towards his mother for never talking to him about his real father, and for leaving him to discover his true parentage for himself. In some interviews, Bundy spoke warmly of his grandparents and told Rule that he identified with and clung to his grandfather. In 1987, however, he and other family members told attorneys that Samuel Cowell was a tyrannical bully and a bigot who hated blacks, Italians, Catholics, and Jews, and beat his wife and the family dog, and swung neighborhood cats by their tails. He once threw Louise's younger sister Julia down a flight of stairs for oversleeping. He sometimes spoke aloud to unseen presences, and at least once flew into a violent rage when the question of Bundy's paternity was raised. Bundy described his grandmother as a timid and obedient woman who periodically underwent electroconvulsive therapy for depression and feared to leave her house toward the end of her life. Bundy occasionally exhibited disturbing behavior at an early age. Julia recalled awakening from a nap to find herself surrounded by knives from the kitchen and Bundy standing by the bed smiling. In 1950, Louise changed her surname from Cowell to Nelson, and at the urging of multiple family members, she left Philadelphia with her son to live with cousins Alan and Jane Scott in Tacoma, Washington. In 1951, Louise met Johnny Culpeper Bundy, a hospital cook, at an adult single night at Tacoma's First Methodist Church. They married later that year and Johnny Bundy formally adopted Ted. Johnny and Louise conceived 4 children of their own, and although Johnny tried to include his adoptive son in camping trips and other family activities, Ted remained distant. He later complained to his girlfriend that Johnny wasn't his real father, wasn't very bright, and didn't make much money. Bundy had different recollections of Tacoma when he spoke to his biographers. When he talked to McCord and Ainsworth, he described how he roamed his neighborhood, picking through trash barrels in search of pictures of naked women. When he spoke to Polly Nelson, he explained how he perused detective magazines, crime novels, and true crime documentaries for stories that involved sexual violence, particularly when the stories were illustrated with pictures of dead or maimed bodies. In a letter to Rule, he asserted that he never, ever read fact detective magazines, and shuddered at the thought that anyone would. In his conversation with McCord, he described how he would consume large quantities of alcohol and canvass the community late at night in search of undraped windows where he could observe women undressing, or whatever else could be seen. Bundy also varied the accounts of his social life. He told McCord and Ainsworth that he chose to be alone as an adolescent because he was unable to understand interpersonal relationships. He claimed that he had no natural sense of how to develop a friendship. "I didn't know what made people want to be friends," he said. "I didn't know what underlay social interactions." Classmates from Woodrow Wilson High School told Rule, however, that Bundy was well known and well liked there, a medium-sized fish in a large pond. Downhill skiing was Bundy's only significant athletic avocation. He enthusiastically pursued the activity by using stolen equipment and forged lift tickets. During high school, he was arrested at least twice on suspicion of burglary and auto theft. When he reached age 18, the details of the incidents were expunged from his record, which is customary in Washington. After graduating from high school in 1965, Bundy attended the University of Puget Sound for 1 year before transferring to the University of Washington to study Chinese. In 1967, he became romantically involved with a UW classmate who identified several pseudonyms in Bundy biographies, most commonly Stephanie Brooks. In early 1968, he dropped out of college and worked at a series of minimum-wage jobs. He also volunteered at the Seattle office of Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign and became Arthur Fletcher's driver and bodyguard during Fletcher's campaign for lieutenant governor of Washington state. In August, Bundy attended the 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami as a Rockefeller delegate. Shortly thereafter, Brooks ended their relationship and returned to her family in California, frustrated by what she described as Bundy's immaturity and lack of ambition. Psychiatrist Dorothy Lewis would later pinpoint this crisis as probably the pivotal time in his development. Devastated by Brooks' rejection, Bundy traveled to Colorado and then farther east, visiting relatives in Arkansas and Philadelphia and enrolling for 1 semester at Temple University. It was at this time in early 1969, Rule believes, that Bundy visited the Office of Birth Records in Burlington and confirmed his true parentage. Bundy was back in Washington by the fall of 1969 when he met Elizabeth Klopfer, a divorcee from Ogden, Utah who worked as a secretary at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Their stormy relationship would continue well past his initial incarceration in Utah in 1976. In mid-1970, Bundy, now focused and goal-oriented, re-enrolled at UW, this time as a psychology major. He became an honor student and was well regarded by his professors. In 1971, he took a job at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center, where he met and worked alongside Ann Rule, a former Seattle police officer. An aspiring crime writer, she would later write one of the definitive Bundy biographies, The Stranger Beside Me. Rule saw nothing disturbing in Bundy's personality at the time and described him as kind, solicitous, and empathic. After graduating from UW in 1972, Bundy joined Governor Daniel J. Evans' re-election campaign. Posing as a college student, he shadowed Evans' team. Evans appointed Bundy to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee. After Evans was re-elected, Bundy was hired as an assistant to Ross Davis, chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. Davis thought well of Bundy and described him as smart, aggressive, and a believer in the system. In early 1973, despite mediocre LSAT scores, Bundy was accepted into the law schools of UPS and the University of Utah on the strength of letters of recommendation from Evans, Davis, and several UW psychology professors. During the trip to California on Republican Party business in the summer of 1973, Bundy rekindled his relationship with Brooks. She marveled at his transformation into a serious, dedicated professional who seemingly on the cusp of a legal and political career. He continued to date Kloepfer as well. Neither woman was aware of the other's existence. In the fall of 1973, Bundy matriculated at UPS Law School and continued courting Brooks, who flew to Seattle several times to stay with him. They discussed marriage. At one point he introduced her to Davis as his fiancée. In January 1974, however, he abruptly broke off all contact. Her phone calls and letters went unreturned. Finally reaching him by phone a month later, Brooks demanded to know why Bundy had unilaterally ended their relationship without explanation. In a flat, calm voice, he replied, "Stephanie, I have no idea what you mean," and hung up. She never heard from him again. He later explained, "I just wanted to prove to myself that I could have married her." Brooks concluded in retrospect that he had deliberately planned the entire courtship and rejection in advance as vengeance for the breakup she initiated in 1968. By then, Bundy had begun skipping classes at law school. By April, he had stopped attending entirely, as the young women began to disappear in the Pacific Northwest. There is no consensus on when or where Bundy began killing women. He told different stories to different people and refused to divulge the specifics of his earliest crimes, even as he confessed in graphic detail to dozens of murders in the days preceding his execution. He told Nelson that he attempted his first kidnapping in 1969 in Ocean City, New Jersey, but did not kill anyone until sometime in 1971 in Seattle. He told psychologist Art Norman that he killed 2 women in Atlantic City in 1969 while visiting family in Philadelphia. He hinted but refused to elaborate to homicide detective Robert D. Keppel that he committed a murder in Seattle in 1972, and another murder in 1973 that involved a hitchhiker near Tumwater. Rule and Keppel both believed he might have started killing as a teenager. Circumstantial evidence suggested that he may have abducted and killed 80-year-old Anne Marie Burr of Tacoma when he was 14 years old in 1961, an allegation that he repeatedly denied. His earliest documented homicides were committed in 1974 when he was 27 years old. By then, by his own admission, he had mastered the necessary skills, in the era before DNA profiling, to leave minimal incriminating forensic evidence at crime scenes. Shortly after midnight on January 4, 1974, Bundy entered the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks and Terry Caldwell, a dancer and student at UW. After bludgeoning Sparks senseless with a metal rod from her bed frame, he sexually assaulted her with either the same rod or metal speculum, causing extensive internal injuries. She remained unconscious for 10 days, but survived with permanent physical and mental disabilities. In the early morning hours of February 1, Bundy broke into the basement room of Linda Ann Healy, a UW undergraduate who broadcast morning radio weather reports for skiers. He beat her unconscious, dressed her in blue jeans, a white blouse, and boots, and carried her away. During the first half of 1974, female college students disappeared at the rate of about 1 per month. On March 12, Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, 60 miles southwest of Seattle, left her dormitory to attend a jazz concert on campus but never arrived. On April 17, Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared while on her way to her dorm room after an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg, 110 miles east-southeast of Seattle. 2 female Central Washington students later came forward to report encounters, one on the night of Rancourt's disappearance, the other 3 nights earlier. with a man wearing an arm sling, asking for help carrying a load of books to his brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. On May 6, Roberta Kathleen Parks left her dormitory at Oregon State University in Corvallis, 85 miles south of Portland, to have coffee with friends at the Memorial Union, but never arrived. Detectives from the King County and Seattle Police Departments grew increasingly concerned. There was no significant physical evidence, and the missing women had little in common, apart from being young, attractive, white college students with long hair parted in the middle. On June 1, Brenda Carol Ball, 22, disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien, near Seattle, Tacoma International Airport. She was last seen in the parking lot, talking to a brown-haired man with his arm in a sling. In the early hours of June 11, UW student Georgianne Hawkins vanished while walking down a brightly lit alley between her boyfriend's dormitory residence and her sorority house. The next morning, 3 Seattle homicide detectives and criminalists combed the entire alleyway on their hands and knees, finding nothing. After Hawkins' disappearance was publicized, witnesses came forward to report seeing a man that night who was in an alley behind a nearby dormitory. He was on crutches with a leg cast and was struggling to carry a briefcase. One woman recalled that the man asked her to help him carry the case to his car, a light, brown Volkswagen Beetle. Bundy later told Keppel that he lured Hawkins to his car before rendering her unconscious with a crowbar he had earlier placed beside the vehicle. He then handcuffed Hawkins and drove her to Issaquah, where he had strangled her, before spending the entire night with her body. Prior to her murder, Hawkins had regained consciousness inside his car, and had begun talking with Bundy, who recollected she had informed him she had a Spanish test the following day and she thought that I had taken her to help tutor her for the Spanish test, adding it's not funny, but it's odd the kinds of things people will say under those circumstances. He admitted to revisiting Hawkins' corpse on 3 occasions. He stated that he returned to the UW alley the morning after Hawkins' abduction and murder. There, in the very midst of a major crime scene investigation, he located and gathered Hawkins' earring and one of her shoes, where he had left them in the adjoining parking lot, and departed, unobserved. During this period, Bundy was working in Olympia as the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission. Later he worked at the Department of Emergency Services, a state government agency involved in the search for the missing women. At Day he met and dated Carol Ann Boone, a twice-divorced mother of 2 who, 6 years later, would play an important role in the final phase of his life. Reports of the 6 missing women and Sparks' brutal beating appeared prominently in newspapers and on television throughout Washington and Oregon. Fear spread among the population, hitchhiking by young women dropped sharply. Pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies, but the paucity of physical evidence severely hampered them. Police could not provide reporters with the little information that was available for fear of compromising the investigation. Further similarities between the victims were noted. The disappearances all took place at night, usually near ongoing construction work, within a week of a midterm or final exams. All of the victims were wearing slacks or blue jeans, and at most crime scenes, there were sightings of a man wearing a cast or a sling, and driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. The Pacific Northwest murders culminated on July 14, with the broad daylight abductions of 2 women from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah, a suburb 20 miles east of Seattle. 5 female witnesses described an attractive young man wearing a white tennis outfit with his left arm in a sling, speaking with a light accent, perhaps Canadian or British. Introducing himself as Ted, he asked their help in unloading a sailboat from his tan or bronze-colored Volkswagen Beetle. 4 refused. 1 accompanied him as far as his car, saw that there was no sailboat, and fled. 3 additional witnesses saw him approach Janice Annott, 23, a probation caseworker at the King County Juvenile Court, with the sailboat story and watched her leave the beach in his company. About 4 hours later, Denise Marie Naslund, a 19-year-old woman who was studying to become a computer programmer, left a picnic to go to the restroom and never returned with Naslund, and that he forced one to watch as he murdered the other, but he later denied it in an interview with Lewis on the eve of his execution. King County Police, finally armed with a detailed description of their suspect and his car, posted flyers throughout the Seattle area. A composite sketch was printed in regional newspapers and broadcast on local television stations. Elizabeth Klopfer, Ann Rule, a day employee, and a UW psychology professor all recognized the profile, the sketch, and the car, and reported Bundy as a possible suspect, but detectives, who were receiving up to 200 tips per day, thought it unlikely that a clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record could be the perpetrator. On September 6, two grouse hunters stumbled across the skeletal remains of Aten Naslin near a service road in Issaquah, 2 miles east of Lake Sammamish State Park. An extra femur and several vertebrae found at the site were later identified by Bundy as George Ann Hawkins. 6 months later, forestry students from Green River Community College discovered the skulls and mandibles of Healy, Runcourt, Parks, and Ball on Taylor Mountain, where Bundy frequently hiked, just east of Issaquah. Manson's remains were never recovered. In August 1974, Bundy received a second acceptance from the University of Utah Law School and moved to Salt Lake City, leaving Klopfer in Seattle. While he called Kleopher often, he dated at least a dozen other women. When he studied the first-year law curriculum a second time, he was devastated to find out that the other students had some intellectual capacity, that he did not. He found the classes completely incomprehensible. "It was a great disappointment to me," he said. A new string of homicides began the following month, including 2 that would remain undiscovered until Bundy confessed to them shortly before his execution. On September 2, he raped and strangled a still unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho, then either disposed of the remains immediately in a nearby river or returned the next day to photograph and dismember the corpse. On October 2, he seized 16-year-old Nancy Wilcoxon Holiday, a suburb of Salt Lake City. Her remains were buried near Capitol Reef National Park, some 200 miles south of Holiday, but were never found. On October 18, Melissa Ann Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of the police chief of Midvale, disappeared after leaving a pizza parlor. Her nude body was found in a nearby mountainous area 9 days later. Post-mortem examination indicated that she may have remained alive for up to 7 days following her disappearance. On October 31, Laura Ann Amy, also 17, disappeared 25 miles south in Lehigh after leaving a cafe just after midnight. Her naked body was found by hikers 9 miles to the northeast in American Fork Canyon on Thanksgiving Day. Both women had been beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with nylon stockings. Years later, Bundy described his post-mortem rituals with the corpses of Smith and Amy, including hair shampooing and application of makeup. In the late afternoon of November 8, Bundy approached 18-year-old telephone operator Carol Durank at Fashion Place Mall in Murray, less than a mile from the Midvale restaurant where Melissa Smith was last seen. He identified himself as Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department and told Durank that someone had attempted to break into her car. He asked her to accompany him to the station to file a complaint. When Durank pointed out to Bundy that he was driving on a road that did not lead to the police station, he immediately pulled her to the shoulder and attempted to handcuff her. During their struggle, he inadvertently fastened both handcuffs to the same wrist, and Durank was able to open the car door and escape. Later that evening, Deborah Jean Kent, a 17-year-old student at Viewmont High School in Bountiful, 20 miles north of Murray, disappeared after leaving a theater production at the school to pick up her brother. The school's drama teacher and the student told the police that a stranger had asked each of them to come out to the parking lot to identify a car. Another student later saw the same man pacing in the rear of the auditorium, and the drama teacher spotted him shortly before the end of the play. Outside the auditorium, investigators found a key that unlocked the handcuffs removed from Carol Durank's wrist. In November, Elizabeth Klopfer called King County Police a second time after reading that young women were disappearing in towns surrounding Salt Lake City. Detective Randy Hergesheimer of the Major Crimes Division interviewed her in detail. By then, Bundy had risen considerably on the King County hierarchy of suspicion, but the Lake Sammamish witness conferred most reliable by detectives failed to identify him from a photo lineup. In December, Clover called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office and repeated her suspicions. Bundy's name was added to their list of suspects, but at that time no credible forensic evidence linked him to the Utah crimes. In January 1975, Bundy returned to Seattle after his final exams and spent a week with Clover, who did not tell him that she had reported him to police on 3 occasions. She made plans to visit him in Salt Lake City in August. In 1975, Bundy shifted much of his criminal activity eastward, from his base in Utah to Colorado. On January 12, a 23-year-old registered nurse named Karen Eileen Campbell disappeared while walking down a well-lit hallway between the elevator and her room at the Wildwood Inn in Snohomish Village, 400 miles southeast of Salt Lake City. Her nude body was found a month later next to a dirt road just outside the resort. She had been killed by blows to her head from a blunt instrument that left distinctive linear grooved depressions on her skull. Her body also bore deep cuts from a sharp weapon. On March 15, 100 miles northeast of Snohomish, Velski instructor Julie Cunningham, 26, disappeared while walking from her apartment to a dinner date with a friend. Bundy later told Colorado investigators that he approached Cunningham on crutches and asked her to help carry his ski boots to his car, where he clubbed and handcuffed her, then assaulted and strangled her at a secondary site near Rifle, 90 miles west of Vail. Weeks later, he made the 6-hour drive from Salt Lake City to revisit her remains. Denise Lynn Oliverson, 25, disappeared near the Utah-Colorado border in Grand Junction on April 6 while riding her bicycle to her parents' house. Her bike and sandals were found under a viaduct near a railroad bridge. On May 6, Bundy lured 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver from Alameda Junior High School in Pocatello, Idaho, 160 miles north of Salt Lake City. He drowned and then sexually assaulted her in his hotel room, before disposing of her body in a river north of Pocatello. In mid-May, 3 of Bundy's Washington State Day co-workers, including Carol Ann Boone, visited him in Salt Lake City and stayed for a week in his apartment. Bundy subsequently spent a week in Seattle with Clover in early June and they discussed getting married the following Christmas. Again, Clover made no mention of her multiple discussions with the King County Police and Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office. Bundy disclosed neither his ongoing relationship with Boone nor a concurrent romance with a Utah law student known in various accounts as Kim Andrews or Sharon Auer. On June 28, Susan Curtis vanished from the campus of Brigham Young University in Provo, 45 miles south of Salt Lake City. Curtis' murder became Bundy's last confession, tape-recorded moments before he entered the execution chamber. The bodies of Wilcox, Kent, Cunningham, Oliverson, Culver, and Curtis were never recovered. In August or September 1975, Bundy was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, although was not an active participant in services and ignored most church restrictions. He would later be excommunicated by the LDS Church following his 1976 kidnapping conviction. When asked about his religious preference after his arrest, Bundy answered Methodist, the religion of his childhood. In Washington state, investigators were still struggling to analyze the Pacific Northwest murder spree that had ended as abruptly as it had begun. In an effort to make sense of an overwhelming mass of data, they resorted to the then innovative strategy of compiling a database. They used the King County payroll computer, a huge, primitive machine by contemporary standards, but the only one available for their use. After inputting the many lists they had compiled, classmates and acquaintances of each victim, Volkswagen owners named Ted, known sex offenders, and so on, they queried the computer for coincidences. Out of thousands of names, 26 turned up on 4 lists. One was Ted Bundy. Detectives also manually compiled a list of their 100 best suspects, and Bundy was on that list as well. He was literally at the top of the pile of suspects when word came from Utah of his arrest. On August 16, 1975, Bundy was arrested by Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward in Granger. Hayward had observed Bundy cruising a residential area in the pre-dawn hours. Bundy fled the area at high speed after seeing the patrol car. The officer searched the car after he noticed that the Volkswagen's front passenger seat had been removed and placed on the rear seats. He found a ski mask, a second mask fashioned from pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags, a coil of rope, an ice pick, and other items initially assumed to be burglary tools. Bundy explained that the ski mask was for skiing, he had found the handcuffs in a dumpster, and the rest were common household items. However, Detective Jerry Thompson remembers a similar suspect and car description from the November 1974 Durank kidnapping, and Bundy's name from Kloepfer's December 1974 phone call. In a search of Bundy's apartment, police found a guide to Colorado ski resorts with a checkmark by the Wildwood Inn and a brochure that advertised the Viewmont High School play in Bountiful, where Deborah Kent had disappeared. The police did not have sufficient evidence to detain Bundy, and he was released on his own recognizance. Bundy later said that searchers missed a hidden collection of Polaroid photographs of his victims, which he destroyed after he was released. Salt Lake City police placed Bundy on 24-hour surveillance, and Thompson flew to Seattle with 2 other detectives to interview Kloepfer. She told them that in the new year prior to Bundy's move to Utah, she had discovered objects that she couldn't understand, in her house and in Bundy's apartment. These items included crutches, a bag of plaster of Paris that he admitted stealing from a medical supply house, and a meat cleaver that was never used for cooking. Additional objects included surgical gloves, an oriental knife in a wooden case that he kept in his glove compartment, and a sack full of woman's clothing. Bundy was perpetually in debt, and Kloepfer suspected that he had stolen almost everything of significant value that he possessed. When she confronted him over a new TV and stereo, he warned her, "If you tell anyone, I'll break your fucking neck." She said Bundy became very upset whenever she considered cutting her hair, which was long and parted in the middle. She would sometimes awaken in the middle of the night to find him under her car, another Volkswagen Beetle, which he often borrowed, for protection. The detectives confirmed that Bundy had not been with Kloepfer on any of the nights which during the Pacific Northwest victims had vanished, nor on the day Ott and Naslund were abducted. Shortly thereafter, Kloepfer was interviewed by Seattle homicide detective Kathy McChesney and learned of the existence of Stephanie Brooks and her brief engagement to Bundy around Christmas 1973. In September, Bundy sold his Volkswagen Beetle to a Midvale teenager. Utah police impounded it, and FBI technicians dismantled and searched it. They found hair-matching samples obtained from Karen Campbell's body. Later, they also identified hair strands as microscopically indistinguishable from those of Melissa Smith and Carol Durank. FBI lab specialist Robert Neal concluded that the presence of hair strands in one car matching 3 different victims who had never met one another would be a coincidence of mind-boggling rarity. On October 2, detectives put Bundy into a lineup. Durank immediately identified him as Officer Roseland, and witnesses from Bountiful recognized him as the stranger at the high school auditorium. There was insufficient evidence to link him to Deborah Kent. There was no more than enough evidence to charge him with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault in the Durank case. He was freed on £15,000 bail, paid by his parents, and spent most of the time between indictment and trial in Seattle, living in Kloepfer's house. Seattle police had insufficient evidence to charge him in the Pacific Northwest murders, but kept him under close surveillance. When Ted and I stepped out on the porch to go somewhere, Kloepfer wrote, so many unmarked police cars started up that it sounded like the beginning of the Indy 500. In November, the 3 principal Bundy investigators, Jerry Thompson from Utah, Robert Keppel from Washington, and Michael Fisher from Colorado, met in Aspen, Colorado and exchanged information with 30 detectives and prosecutors from 5 states. While officials left the meeting convinced that Bundy was the murderer they sought, they agreed that more hard evidence would be needed before he could be charged with any of the murders. In February 1976, Bundy stood trial for the Durank kidnapping, On the advice of his attorney, John O'Connell, Bundy waived his right to a jury due to the negative publicity surrounding the case. After a 4-day bench trial and a weekend of deliberation, Judge Stuart Hansen Jr. found him guilty of kidnapping and assault. In June he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. In October, he was found hiding in bushes in the prison yard carrying an escape kit, road maps, airline schedules, and a social security card, and spent several weeks in solitary confinement. Later that month, Colorado authorities charged him with Karen Campbell's murder. After a period of resistance, he waived the extradition proceeding and was transferred to Aspen in January 1977. On June 7, 1977, Bundy was transported 40 miles from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs to Pitkin Country Courthouse in Aspen for a preliminary hearing. He had elected to serve as his own attorney, and as such, was excused by the judge from wearing handcuffs or leg shackles. During a recess, he asked to visit the courthouse's law library to research his case. While shielded from his guard's view behind a bookcase, he opened the window and jumped to the ground from the second story, injuring his right ankle as he landed. After shedding an outer layer of clothing, he walked through Aspen as roadblocks were being set up on its outskirts, then hiked southward onto Aspen Mountain near its summit. He broke into a hunting cabin and stole food, clothing, and a rifle. The following day he left the cabin and continued south toward the town of Crested Butte, but became lost in the forest. For 2 days he wandered aimlessly on the mountain, missing 2 trails that led downward to his intended destination. On June 10, he broke into a camping trailer on Maroon Lake, 10 miles south of Aspen, taking food and a ski parka, but instead of continuing southward, he walked back north toward Aspen, eluding roadblocks and search parties along the way. 3 days later, he stole a car at the edge of Aspen Golf Course. Cold, sleep-deprived, and in constant pain from his sprained ankle, he drove back into Aspen, where 2 police officers noticed his car weaving in and out of its lane and pulling him over. He had been a fugitive for 6 days. In the car were maps of the mountain area around Aspen that prosecutors were using to demonstrate the location of Karen Campbell's body, indicating his escape was not a spontaneous act but had been planned. Back in jail in Glenwood Springs, Bundy ignored the advice of friends and legal advisors to stay put. The case against him, already weak at best, was deteriorating steadily as pre-trial motions consistently resolved in his favor and significant bits of evidence was ruled inadmissible. A more rational defendant might have realized that he stood a good chance of acquittal and that beating the murder charge in Colorado would probably have dissuaded other prosecutors. With as little as 1.5 years to serve on the Durank conviction, had Ted persevered, he could have been a free man. Instead, Bundy assembled a new escape plan. He acquired a detailed floor plan of the jail and a hacksaw blade from other inmates, and accumulated $500 in cash, smuggled in over a 6-month period, he later said, by visitors, Carol Ann Boone in particular. During the evenings, while other prisoners were showering, he sawed a hole about 1 square foot between the steel-reinforced bars in the ceiling of his cell and, having lost 35 pounds, was able to wriggle through it into the crawl space above. In the weeks that followed, he made a series of practice runs, exploring the space. Multiple reports from an informant of movement within the ceiling during the night were not investigated. By late 1977, Bundy's impending trial had become a cause célèbre in the small town of Aspen, and Bundy filed a motion for a change of venue to Denver. On December 23, the Aspen trial judge granted the request, but to Colorado Springs, where juries had historically been hostile to murder suspects. On the night of December 30, with most of the jail staff on Christmas break and nonviolent prisoners on furlough with their families, Bundy piled books and files in his bed, covered them with a blanket to simulate his sleeping body, and climbed into the crawl space. He broke through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening with his wife, changed into street clothes from the jailer's closet, and walked out the front door to freedom. After stealing a car, Bundy drove eastward out of Glenwood Springs, but the car soon broke down in the mountains on Interstate 70. A passing motorist gave him a ride into Vail, 60 miles to the east. From there he caught a bus to Denver, where he boarded a morning flight to Chicago. In Glenwood Springs, the jailer's skeleton crew did not discover the escape until noon on December 31, more than 17 hours later. By then, Bundy was already in Chicago. Shortly after the conclusion of the Leach trial and the beginning of the long appeals that followed, Bundy initiated a series of interviews with Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth. Speaking mostly in the third person to avoid the stigma of confession, he began for the first time to divulge details of his crimes and thought processes. He recounted his career as a thief, confirming Kopfer's longtime suspicion that he had shoplifted virtually everything of substance that he owned. "The big payoff for me," he said, "was actually possessing whatever it was I had stolen. I really enjoyed having something that I had wanted and gone out and take." Possession proved to be an important motive for rape and murder as well. Sexual assault, he said, fulfilled his need to totally possess his victims. At first, he killed his victims as a matter of expediency, to eliminate the possibility of being caught, but later, murder became part of the adventure. The ultimate possession was, in fact, the taking of the life, he said, and then the physical possession of the remains. Bundy also confided in Special Agent William Hagmaier of the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit. Hagmaier was struck with the deep, almost mystical satisfaction that Bundy took in murder. He said that after a while, murder is not just a crime of lust of violence, Hagmaier related. It becomes possession. They are part of you. The victim becomes a part of you, and you will always be drawn back to them. Bundy told Hagmaier that he considered himself to be an amateur and impulsive killer in his early years, before moving into what he termed his prime or predator phase at about the time of Linda Healy's murder in 1974. This implied that he began killing well before 1974, although he never explicitly admitted to having done so. In July 1984, Rayford guards found 2 hacksaw blades that Bundy had hidden in his cell. A steel bar in one of the cell's windows had been sawed completely through at the top and bottom and glued back into place with a homemade soap-based adhesive. Several months later, guards found an unauthorized mirror hidden in the cell, and Bundy was again moved to a different cell. Shortly thereafter, he was charged with a disciplinary infraction for unauthorized correspondence with another night-profile criminal, John Hinckley Jr. In October 1984, Bundy contacted Robert Kebbell and offered to share his self-proclaimed expertise in serial killer psychology in the ongoing hunt in Washington for the Green River Killer, later identified as Gary Ridgway. Kebbell and Green River Task Force Detective Dave Reichert interviewed Bundy, but Ridgway remained at large for a further 17 years. Kebbell published detailed documentation of the Green River interviews and later collaborated with Michaud on another examination of the interview material. Bundy coined the nickname the River Man for Gary Ridgway, which was later used for the title of Kebbell's book, The Riverman, Ted Bundy and I Hunt for the Green River Killer. In early 1986, an execution date was set on the Chiomega convictions. The Supreme Court issued a brief stay, but the execution was quickly rescheduled. In April, shortly after the new date was announced, Bundy finally confessed to Hagmaier and Nelson what they believed was the full range of his depredation, including details of what he did to some of his victims after their deaths. He told them that he visited Taylor Mountain, Issaquah, and other secondary crime scenes, often several times, to lie with his victims and perform sexual acts with their decomposing bodies until putrefaction forced him to stop. In some cases, he drove for several hours each way and remained the entire night. In Utah, he applied makeup to Melissa Smith's lifeless face, and he repeatedly washed Laura Amy's hair. "If you've got time," he told Hagmaier, "they can be anything you want them to be." He decapitated approximately 12 of his victims with a hacksaw and kept at least one group of severed heads, probably the 4 later found on Taylor Mountain, in his apartment for a period of time before disposing of them. Less than 15 hours before the scheduled July 2 execution, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals stayed it indefinitely and remanded the Chiomega case for review on multiple technicalities, including Bundy's mental competency to stand trial, and an erroneous instruction by the judge during the penalty, which, ultimately, were never resolved. A new date was then set to carry out the Leach sentence. The 11th Circuit Court issued a stay on November 17. In mid-1988, the 11th Circuit ruled against Bundy, and on December 24, 1989, was announced. Bundy's journey through the appeals court had been unusually rapid for a capital murder case. Contrary to popular belief, the courts moved Bundy as fast as they could. Even the prosecutors acknowledged that Bundy's lawyers never employed delaying tactics. Though people everywhere seethed at the apparent delay in executing the archdemon, Ted Bundy was actually on the fast track. With all avenues exhausted and no further motivation to deny his crimes, Bundy agreed to speak frankly with investigators. He confessed to Keppel that he had committed all 8 of the Washington and Oregon homicides for which he was the prime suspect. He described 3 additional previously unknown victims in Washington and 2 in Oregon whom he declined to identify. He said he left a 5th corpse, Donna Manson's, on Taylor Mountain, but incinerated her head in Copher's fireplace. He described the Issaquah crime scene, and it was almost like he was there. He was just totally consumed with murder all the time. Nelson's impressions were similar. It was the absolute misogyny of his crimes that stunned me, she wrote, his manifest rage against women. He had no compassion at all. He was totally engrossed in the details. His murders were his life accomplishments. Bundy confessed to detectives from Idaho, Utah, and Colorado that he had committed numerous additional homicides,